In the final hours or minutes before death, something remarkable and deeply unsettling occurs in some patients who have been comatose, severely dementia-affected, or profoundly unresponsive for extended periods. They suddenly regain complete clarity of mind, speak coherently, recognize loved ones by name, engage in meaningful conversation, and demonstrate full awareness of their surroundings and circumstances, only to slip back into unconsciousness or die within minutes or hours of this inexplicable awakening. Families describe witnessing their deeply confused relatives suddenly orient themselves perfectly to time, place, and person, asking specific questions about family members, settling old disputes, expressing love they had been unable to communicate for years, or providing instructions for their affairs with remarkable lucidity and precision, as though the veil of illness that had obscured their consciousness for months or years had instantaneously lifted. Nursing staff and physicians have documented countless cases where patients who have not spoken intelligibly in extended periods suddenly produce complex, grammatically correct sentences and demonstrate cognitive function that appears completely inconsistent with their documented medical condition and the severe neurological deterioration they have experienced. The mechanism behind terminal lucidity remains profoundly mysterious, as conventional neuroscience offers no satisfactory explanation for how a brain demonstrating marked atrophy, advanced dementia, or significant damage could suddenly recover full functional capacity in its final moments. Nor can we explain why this recovery is invariably temporary and followed by death or permanent unconsciousness. Despite the lack of any coherent biological model that accounts for these phenomena, terminal lucidity persists across different cultures, medical systems, and healthcare settings, remaining one of the most documented yet scientifically inexplicable experiences surrounding human death, challenging our fundamental assumptions about consciousness, brain function, and the irreversible nature of neurological decline. In hospitals and hospices across the world, medical staff regularly document accounts from dying patients who report seeing deceased relatives, luminous figures, or landscapes that seem to exist beyond the veil of the physical world. These deathbed visions occur in the final hours or days of life, often when the patient is lucid enough to communicate what they are experiencing, and they describe encounters so vivid, so emotionally compelling, and so consistent across cultures and centuries that they have become one of the most widespread phenomena associated with the dying process. A patient might suddenly turn their gaze toward an empty corner of the room and greet a mother who died decades earlier, or describe a deceased sibling standing at the foot of their bed, sometimes reaching out or beckoning them forward. These are not hallucinations born from delirium or medication. They occur in patients with clear mental faculties, and the experiences consistently bring profound comfort rather than fear. The psychological explanation most often offered is that the dying brain, flooded with endorphins and facing imminent shutdown, manufactures these visions as a coping mechanism, a final gift from the body to ease the transition from life to death. The brain's temporal lobe, responsible for memory and emotion, may be firing in unusual patterns as oxygen depletes, retrieving cherished faces and creating scenarios of reunion that soothe the dying. Yet this explanation, while neurologically plausible, does not account for why these visions are so remarkably consistent in their emotional tenor and their seeming purpose, nor does it explain why patients who experience them report a profound shift in their acceptance of death. Despite having reasonable scientific frameworks through which to understand deathbed visions, medicine has largely normalized them as a natural part of dying rather than aggressively investigating what produces them, leaving the phenomenon suspended between biological mechanism and something far more mysterious. Among the most enigmatic phenomena witnessed at the threshold of death is the shared death experience, wherein individuals who are not themselves dying report witnessing visions, presences, or supernatural occurrences at the exact moment a loved one passes away, sometimes from great distances. These accounts describe family members seeing deceased relatives they did not know had died, feeling sudden and overwhelming presences in empty rooms, or experiencing synchronized sensory phenomena such as hearing music or smelling fragrances with no identifiable source, only to later learn these events coincided precisely with a death elsewhere. Some documented cases involve individuals in different countries reporting nearly identical visions of the same deceased person appearing to them simultaneously, suggesting some form of coordinated consciousness rather than isolated hallucination. The phenomenon differs fundamentally from grief-induced manifestations or mourning psychology, because the witnesses often have no prior knowledge that death has occurred, eliminating expectation or anticipatory anxiety as contributing factors. Medical science proposes conventional explanations, such as electromagnetic fluctuations in the brain during moments of emotional resonance, or the idea that shared neural patterns between closely bonded individuals might create synchronized psychological states. Yet these theories remain speculative and inadequately account for the specificity and verifiable accuracy of the experiences reported. What persists as puzzling is how this phenomenon continues to be documented across cultures, time periods, and demographic groups, despite the absence of any scientifically measurable mechanism that would permit consciousness or sensory information to bridge the distance between the living and the newly deceased, or between two living individuals separated by thousands of miles, suggesting either a fundamental gap in our understanding of consciousness itself or a deeply normalized phenomenon. We have chosen to relegate to psychological explanation rather than investigate as a genuine anomaly worthy of rigorous scientific scrutiny. Throughout the medical literature and anecdotal reports from hospice workers and hospital staff across multiple decades, there emerges a peculiar clustering phenomenon known colloquially as the peak in Darien effect, named after observations first systematized in a Connecticut coastal community but subsequently documented in hospitals and care facilities worldwide. The pattern describes an inexplicable surge in patient deaths occurring within narrow temporal windows, often spanning mere hours or days, where mortality rates spike dramatically above baseline expectations, defying conventional actuarial models and challenging our understanding of how physiological decline operates. During these mysterious peaks, patients who appeared stable or progressing along predictable trajectories suddenly deteriorate in synchronized waves, as though responding to some unseen signal or pressure that transcends individual medical circumstances. Medical professionals have observed that these clusters frequently cluster around specific times, particular seasons, or in correlation with astronomical events, meteorological patterns, or even social gatherings in proximity to care facilities. Yet no causal mechanism has been credibly established through rigorous scientific investigation. The prevailing psychological explanation suggests that heightened awareness among caregivers creates confirmation bias, where staff unconsciously begin monitoring patients more closely during perceived high-risk periods, thereby noticing deaths that would have occurred anyway but now seem temporally grouped. Additionally, some researchers propose that stress cascades among medical personnel themselves might inadvertently translate into subtle changes in patient care quality, medication administration timing, or end-of-life decision-making that subtly influences outcomes without any conscious deliberation. In the hours or sometimes mere minutes before death, medical professionals and family members have documented a peculiar and unsettling phenomenon known as the final surge, a sudden and dramatic improvement in the condition of a dying patient who has been declining for days or even weeks. A person who has been unresponsive, struggling to breathe, and barely conscious will abruptly become lucid, alert, and communicative, often asking for food or water, expressing clarity of thought, and displaying an energy that seems entirely inconsistent with their deteriorating physical state. Family members who have maintained a vigil at the bedside will often describe this moment with a mixture of hope and confusion, witnessing their loved one suddenly seem almost recovered, only to have this window of apparent wellness close entirely within hours or even minutes, followed by rapid decline and death. Nurses and hospice workers report that this phenomenon occurs frequently enough to be a recognized pattern in end-of-life care, yet it defies straightforward physiological explanation, as it appears to contradict everything we understand about organ failure and the progressive nature of terminal decline. Various theories have been proposed to account for this surge, including the possibility of a final release of endogenous opioids and neurochemicals as the brain recognizes its own ending, or alternatively a compensatory surge in adrenaline and cortisol that provides one last burst of energy before complete system shutdown. Some medical professionals suggest that the apparent clarity might be partly illusory, a subjective interpretation by emotionally overwhelmed family members who are desperate to see improvement and meaning in the final moments. Yet this explanation fails to account for the objective behavioral changes, the ability to speak coherently, and the genuine cognitive function that witnesses consistently report, phenomena that should not occur in a brain progressively starved of oxygen and functioning with multiple organ failures. One of the most widely reported phenomena occurring in the final moments of life is the vision of deceased loved ones, an experience documented across virtually every culture and throughout recorded history, where dying individuals claim to perceive family members who have already passed away, often describing them as luminous, peaceful, or beckoning them toward some unseen realm. And these encounters are reported with such consistency and emotional authenticity that they cannot easily be dismissed as mere hallucination or delusion. When a patient who has been unconscious for days suddenly becomes alert and lucid, speaking clearly about their departed mother standing at the foot of the bed or their late spouse reaching out to them, hospital staff and family members find themselves confronted with a phenomenon that existing neurology and psychology struggle to adequately explain. For the dying brain is typically in a state of declining oxygen and neurochemical chaos, yet somehow produces visions of remarkable clarity and purpose, rather than the confused or nightmarish images one might expect from a deteriorating consciousness. These visions possess a peculiar quality that distinguishes them from typical hallucinations. They are almost never frightening, they are remarkably consistent in their characteristics across different individuals, and perhaps most significantly, they frequently provide the dying person with a sense of comfort, reassurance, and what witnesses describe as a profound acceptance of their impending death, a psychological shift that sometimes seems to reduce suffering and ease the transition toward the end. There exist countless documented cases throughout history and across cultures in which individuals have reported the sudden, inexplicable knowledge that a distant loved one has died at the precise moment of that person's passing, often before any communication could possibly have reached them through conventional means. A woman in rural England might awaken in the middle of the night with an overwhelming sense of dread, only to learn hours later that her son, stationed thousands of miles away in a military conflict, had been killed in action at that exact moment. A man sitting quietly in his home office suddenly feels an intense cold pass through his body and experiences an unmistakable inner certainty that his elderly mother, who lives on another continent, has just taken her final breath, a knowledge confirmed by a telephone call arriving minutes afterward. These experiences have been reported consistently across different time periods, geographic locations, religious traditions, and socioeconomic backgrounds, suggesting something more than mere coincidence or cultural transmission. The prevailing psychological explanation centers on the idea of pareidolia and pattern recognition, the human tendency to construct meaning from random occurrences and to remember the instances that align with reality while forgetting the vastly greater number of premonitions that never materialize. Our brains are extraordinarily efficient at retrospective narrative construction, at weaving together fragments of intuition, subtle behavioral changes, and unconscious body language into a coherent story of supernatural knowledge. Yet this explanation, while theoretically sound, fails to account for the specificity and precision of many documented cases, the witnesses who have written detailed accounts sealed before any confirmation could arrive, or the families who have independently reported receiving the same knowledge at identical times despite being separated by thousands of miles. Among the most perplexing accounts documented by hospice workers and near-death experience researchers are cases in which patients who have been blind since birth or early childhood, often for decades, report seeing light during their final moments or during periods of unconsciousness before death. These individuals, who have no experiential reference point for what light actually looks like, describe it with remarkable consistency and specificity, using words like radiant, golden, warm, and brilliant in ways that suggest genuine visual perception rather than learned vocabulary or cultural conditioning. Some recount seeing colors they have no linguistic framework to describe, colors they claim exist beyond the spectrum they learned about through education, colors that seem to possess qualities of both luminescence and texture simultaneously. Family members and medical staff present during these moments report profound bewilderment, as the patients articulate visual phenomena with a clarity and confidence that contrasts sharply with their lifelong dependence on tactile and auditory understanding of the world around them. The standard psychological explanation suggests that blind individuals, despite their lack of sight, have developed mental models of light through language, metaphor, and abstraction, allowing them to construct descriptions of luminosity through conceptual rather than experiential means. Yet this explanation falters when confronted with the specific, unexpected details that emerge in such accounts. Details that don't align with common cultural representations of light or heaven, details that suggest some form of perception operating independently of the damaged visual pathways. The phenomenon persists in medical literature with little satisfactory resolution, remaining one of those mysteries that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of neuroscience, consciousness studies, and the genuinely inexplicable, documented but not understood, observed but not explained. Among the most persistently documented phenomena reported by near-death experiencers are accounts of observing verifiable details about their surroundings, while their consciousness appeared to be completely disconnected from their physical body. And crucially, these accounts have sometimes been independently confirmed by medical staff and witnesses present in the operating room or hospital room at the time. Cases have emerged in peer-reviewed literature where patients who experienced cardiac arrest or profound unconsciousness later reported specific conversations between surgeons, the exact positioning of medical equipment, descriptions of individuals who entered the room, and details about procedures performed on their bodies, all of which were subsequently verified as accurate by the medical team who had no knowledge that these observations were being claimed. One particularly notable case involved a woman who reported observing a tennis shoe on a ledge outside her hospital window from a perspective that would have been impossible from her bed, and when the ledge was later checked, the shoe was indeed found exactly where she had described it. The conventional neurological explanation suggests that fragmentary sensory information somehow persists even during states of profound unconsciousness, and that the brain constructs a coherent narrative from these scattered inputs, essentially creating a false sense of detachment and observation that feels real but is merely a reconstruction. However, this mechanism struggles to adequately account for the specificity and accuracy of details that could not reasonably be perceived or inferred from the patient's physical position, or for the fact that many such reports contain information that was genuinely unknown to the patient's conscious mind at the time. One of the most haunting and inexplicable phenomena observed in end-of-life care involves patients with advanced dementia who have lost the ability to communicate coherently for months or even years, suddenly regaining complete clarity and lucidity in their final hours or days before death. Family members describe arriving at bedsides to find loved ones who could barely recognize them moments before now engaging in full conversations, recalling memories with perfect precision, asking meaningful questions about the world around them, and even offering advice or reconciliation to those gathered near. These moments are often described as profoundly moving and sometimes disturbing because the lucidity appears without explanation and vanishes just as mysteriously when death arrives. Some patients who haven't spoken in months suddenly become eloquent, while others who were trapped in loops of repetitive behavior suddenly break free from those patterns entirely. Medical professionals have attempted to explain this phenomenon through various mechanisms, including final surges of neurological activity, the release of certain neurotransmitters in the dying brain, or the possibility that dementia may not have destroyed the memories, but merely blocked access to them until the final moments when all neural gates somehow open simultaneously. Yet these explanations remain speculative and incomplete because we cannot reliably predict when this phenomenon will occur, we cannot measure it objectively in most cases, and we certainly cannot replicate it or test it in controlled conditions. The phenomenon persists in medical literature and in countless family accounts, sometimes called terminal lucidity or nearing death awareness, yet we continue to treat it as an anomaly rather than a fundamental question about the nature of consciousness, memory, and what actually happens inside the failing human brain as it approaches its absolute end. Throughout medical history and across countless cultures, there exists a phenomenon where terminally ill patients appear to possess an uncanny ability to predict the precise moment of their own death, often specifying not just the day, but the exact hour at which they will pass away. And remarkably, these predictions frequently prove accurate with an astonishing consistency that defies conventional medical explanation. Families report instances where dying relatives have calmly announced that they will depart at 3 in the afternoon or midnight or dawn, and medical staff have documented cases where patients have essentially scheduled their own deaths around these predicted moments, waiting until a specific family member arrives before releasing their grip on life, or conversely, holding on past the predicted hour with visible struggle before finally succumbing moments later. These accounts come not from anecdotal folklore but from hospice nurses, palliative care physicians, and grief counselors who have witnessed this pattern repeatedly throughout their careers, each instance seemingly more inexplicable than the last, suggesting some form of internal biological clock operating at a level beyond conscious awareness or measurable vital signs. The psychological mechanisms that might underpin this phenomenon remain poorly understood, though some researchers have speculated that the dying brain undergoes profound neurochemical changes that could theoretically heighten sensitivity to subtle bodily signals, internal organ failure patterns, or even circadian rhythms that the conscious mind interprets as temporal knowledge. Others suggest that patients may unconsciously recognize deteriorating conditions that signal imminent death and convert these observations into specific time predictions, essentially making educated guesses that occasionally align with actual mortality due to statistical probability rather than genuine precognition. There exists a curious and deeply unsettling pattern observed by hospice workers, nurses, and family members at bedsides around the world. Dying individuals often seem to select the precise moment of their own death, waiting until a specific person arrives, departs, or until a particular condition is met before they finally surrender to the inevitable. A daughter reports stepping out of her father's room for the first time in 3 days, only to receive a call moments later that he had passed. A son describes his mother clinging to life through months of decline, only to let go within hours of his arrival from overseas. A wife sits vigil for weeks as her husband hovers between consciousness and coma, and the instant she finally leaves to shower and change clothes, his heart stops. These accounts are not rare or isolated. They form a consistent thread through end-of-life care, reported by medical professionals across different cultures, continents, and decades with remarkable consistency. The mechanism behind this phenomenon remains scientifically opaque, defying easy explanation through either neurology or physiology. Some researchers propose that dying patients retain a heightened awareness of their environment despite apparent unresponsiveness, that hearing and emotional perception may persist long after other faculties have dimmed, allowing them to unconsciously time their deaths around loved ones' presence. Others suggest a subtle interplay of will and biology, where the human body possesses an unknown capacity to sustain or release itself based on psychological readiness and relational circumstances. Yet neither explanation fully accounts for the specificity and timing involved, nor do they address why this phenomenon shows no signs of diminishing despite modern medicine's unprecedented understanding of dying. We have normalized this as merely coincidence, as the power of attention and anecdotal memory, yet it persists in ways that suggest something deeper remains unknown about human consciousness at the threshold of death. Among the most peculiar and consistent deathbed phenomena documented across cultures and centuries is what caregivers and medical professionals have come to recognize as waiting for permission, a pattern in which terminally ill patients who appear ready to die will often linger in a state of semi-consciousness for days or even weeks, their bodies sustained by machines or basic care, until a specific family member arrives, speaks to them, or in some cases, grants explicit or implicit permission for them to let go. Families frequently report that a dying relative will remain in a stable but unresponsive condition, showing no signs of improvement yet no immediate decline, until a distant adult child finally makes the journey to the bedside, at which point the patient passes within hours or even minutes of that arrival or conversation. In other documented cases, patients have been observed to hover in this liminal state until someone says the words, "It's okay to go," or "We'll be all right," after which they quickly deteriorate and die, as though they were waiting for explicit emotional clearance to release their grip on life. This phenomenon defies conventional medical understanding because the mechanism is not physiological, but appears to be fundamentally psychological or perhaps even spiritual in nature. Yet it occurs with such frequency and across such diverse populations that it cannot reasonably be dismissed as coincidence or confirmation bias. Medical science struggles to explain why a person whose brain is severely damaged, whose organs are failing, whose body is racked with terminal illness, would somehow possess the cognitive and emotional capacity to recognize a specific voice, to understand the meaning of permission, and to voluntarily suppress their body's death process until that condition is met. There exists a deeply unsettling pattern that emerges across hospitals, hospices, and private homes throughout the world. The phenomenon of terminally ill patients dying precisely when they are alone, often within moments of a family member stepping out of the room for the first time in hours or even days. Caregivers and medical professionals report with striking consistency that patients who have lingered in a semi-conscious state, seemingly waiting for something or someone, will pass away during the brief window when their devoted companion visits the bathroom, makes a phone call in the hallway, or finally leaves to rest after an exhausting vigil. The timing appears almost deliberately orchestrated, as if the dying person possessed some form of awareness or control over the exact moment of their departure, choosing solitude over the presence of their loved ones. This pattern repeats so frequently that it has become a recognized anecdote within nursing culture, discussed in break rooms and documented in countless memoirs written by bereaved family members who describe the eerie coincidence of stepping away only to return and discover that the person they were caring for has slipped away. Some patients have even been observed opening their eyes, seemingly aware, moments after visitors left the room, as though they had been waiting for privacy to finally let go. The mechanism behind this phenomenon remains profoundly mysterious, and while some propose psychological explanations rooted in the dying person's need for autonomy or fear of burdening loved ones with the trauma of witnessing death, these theories fail to account for the precision of timing involved or the apparent consciousness required to orchestrate such a departure. Yet despite lacking any coherent scientific explanation, this occurrence has become so normalized within end-of-life care that family members are now routinely advised to expect it, transforming a genuinely inexplicable event into accepted wisdom, making it all the more remarkable that medicine has never adequately explained why the dying would choose their final moments of existence in apparent solitude. Throughout history and across virtually every culture on Earth, there exist persistent accounts of timepieces stopping abruptly at the exact moment a person dies, as though some invisible force reaches out to freeze the mechanisms of time itself at the threshold between life and death. These incidents have been documented in family records, journals, and medical observations for centuries, with countless individuals reporting that a beloved relative's pocket watch, wall clock, or grandfather clock ceased functioning precisely when that person drew their final breath, sometimes occurring miles away from the clock's physical location. The phenomenon has touched the lives of ordinary people and the prominent alike, creating a haunting sense that death itself possesses some strange capacity to interrupt the ordered progression of measured time. In many recorded cases, these clocks resume their normal operation after remaining stopped for days or even weeks, sometimes never keeping accurate time again, as if they had been fundamentally altered by their contact with mortality. The psychological mechanism underlying this widespread phenomenon likely stems from humanity's deep need to find meaning and connection in moments of profound loss and transition. When we experience the death of someone close to us, our minds are heightened and searching for signs, for cosmic acknowledgement that this person's departure was significant enough to register in the physical universe, and a stopped clock provides that tangible, verifiable evidence that something extraordinary has occurred. The human brain is remarkably skilled at pattern recognition and memory reconstruction, particularly during states of emotional intensity, and we may unconsciously notice a stopped clock and retroactively align it with the time of death, or simply remember only the clocks that support this narrative while forgetting the countless others that continued ticking without ceremony. In 1920, a physician named Duncan MacDougall conducted an experiment that would haunt the intersection of science and spirituality for over a century. He placed dying patients on a specially constructed bed scale, one so sensitive it could measure weight changes of mere fractions of an ounce, and he waited for the moment of death to arrive. According to MacDougall's meticulous records, at the precise instant each patient expired, the scale registered a sudden loss of weight equivalent to approximately 21 grams, roughly 3/4 of an ounce. MacDougall theorized that what he had measured was nothing less than the physical weight of the human soul departing from the body, a quantifiable proof that consciousness possessed mass and therefore existed independent of flesh and bone. His findings were published in a respected medical journal and immediately ignited fierce debate among the scientific establishment, with critics pointing out methodological flaws, inadequate sample sizes, and the inability of other researchers to replicate his results. Yet despite the scientific consensus dismissing his work, the notion of the 21 grams persisted in popular culture, becoming a metaphor for the immeasurable essence of human existence, referenced in literature, film, and philosophy as though it contained some fundamental truth about our nature. The explanation for MacDougall's measurements likely rested in the mundane facts of bodily physics. The sudden cessation of perspiration, the expulsion of bodily gases at the moment of death, and the cooling of the corpse, all of which could account for slight weight variations that his imperfect instruments might have misinterpreted or that he unconsciously observed through the lens of his own metaphysical expectations. Remarkably, this experiment from the early 20th century, thoroughly debunked and abandoned by serious science, continues to circulate in discussions of consciousness and the afterlife, proof that once an idea captures our imagination with sufficient poignancy, evidence becomes almost irrelevant to its persistence. Among the most frequently reported observations made by those present at the moment of death, or by medical personnel attending to the recently deceased, is the appearance of a thin, luminous mist or vapor that seems to rise from the body at the precise instant of expiration, a phenomenon that has been documented across countless cultures, time periods, and geographical regions with remarkable consistency. Witnesses describe this manifestation as a translucent cloud that hovers briefly above the deceased before dissipating into the surrounding air, sometimes accompanied by a slight warmth or unusual atmospheric disturbance that cannot be easily attributed to standard physiological processes or environmental factors. The mist is often reported to emerge from the head or chest region, moving upward with what observers characterize as purposeful motion, and in some accounts, the substance appears to possess a subtle luminescence or faint coloration that distinguishes it from ordinary water vapor or breath condensation. Medical science has yet to provide a comprehensive explanation for this phenomenon, though skeptics have proposed theories involving the rapid cooling of the body causing moisture in the lungs to condense and escape, or the final exhalation creating visible breath under specific temperature and humidity conditions. However, these conventional explanations fail to account for why such mist appears so deliberately, why it maintains coherence rather than dispersing immediately like normal breath vapor, or why countless observers across disparate cultures have independently reported nearly identical experiences with such specificity and consistency. The persistence of these accounts in hospital records, hospice documentation, and personal testimonies from nurses and family members suggests something more complex than simple moisture condensation. Yet the mainstream scientific community remains largely silent on the matter, treating it as anecdotal folklore rather than a phenomenon worthy of systematic investigation. Among the most frequently documented deathbed phenomena is the sudden appearance of inexplicable light that witnesses describe as filling the entire room during a person's final moments, a radiance that seems to emanate from no identifiable source and often persists for several seconds after the individual has expired, leaving observers shaken and profoundly moved by what they have witnessed. Family members and medical professionals alike have reported standing in dimly lit hospice rooms or hospital wards when, without any change in electrical lighting or external conditions, the space becomes suffused with a soft, luminous glow that appears almost uniform in its distribution, casting no shadows and creating no discernible reflections on surfaces, a quality that distinguishes these accounts from ordinary illumination. The phenomenon has been recorded across cultures and centuries, from Victorian deathbed accounts to contemporary hospital settings, suggesting either a remarkable consistency in human observation or an actual physical event that transcends cultural boundaries and technological changes. One possible explanation centers on the physiology of the dying brain itself, where the final cascade of neurochemical events and electrical activity might create profound hallucinations in the consciousness of the dying person. And if consciousness somehow extends beyond the individual in ways we do not yet understand, perhaps this altered state generates something perceptible to nearby observers as luminosity. Another framework suggests that extreme emotional states in witnesses, particularly the intensity of grief and heightened attention during a loved one's death, might create a form of collective perception or shared altered consciousness that produces the sensation of brightness without external source. In hospices and hospital wards around the world, caregivers have documented a phenomenon so consistent that it warrants serious consideration despite its inexplicable nature. The dying person who begins to hear music that no one else can perceive. A patient in the final hours of life will suddenly pause, their eyes moving as though tracking something invisible, their head tilting slightly as if listening intently to a distant symphony. When asked what they hear, they describe orchestras, choirs, or melodies of profound beauty, often accompanied by a sense of peace and recognition, as though the music itself is welcoming them toward something beyond the veil of consciousness. Family members lean in, straining to hear even the faintest note, but silence is all that greets their ears. The phenomenon is neither hallucination nor delirium in the clinical sense, because the person remains lucid, coherent, and capable of describing the experience with remarkable clarity and detail. One explanation suggests that as the brain approaches death, certain neural pathways may fire in unusual patterns, creating sensory experiences that feel entirely authentic to the person experiencing them, a kind of final gift from the mind as it prepares for transition. Yet this explanation alone seems insufficient, because the consistency of the reports, the peaceful expressions that accompany them, and the way dying individuals often recognize the music as personally meaningful suggests something more complex than random neurological noise. We have normalized this as merely another symptom of the dying process, categorized it alongside other end-of-life experiences, and filed it away in our mental libraries of acceptable phenomena. But the question persists in quiet moments. If the mind creates beauty at its own threshold, what is the purpose of that beauty, and how can we explain the profound sense of recognition that so often accompanies it? Throughout documented history, families separated by distance have reported witnessing the sudden appearance of a dying or recently deceased loved one at the precise moment of that person's death, despite having no prior knowledge that anything was wrong. These visions, known as crisis apparitions, typically manifest as a fleeting glimpse of the person in their usual appearance, often accompanied by a sense of profound presence or emotional weight that lingers long after the figure vanishes. The experiences are frequently reported by multiple witnesses in the same location, lending them a quality of shared reality rather than isolated hallucination, and they occur across cultures, time periods, and socioeconomic backgrounds with remarkable consistency. Documented cases include soldiers appearing to family members as they fell in battle thousands of miles away, sailors materializing in childhood homes at the exact moment their ship sank, and terminal patients visiting relatives they hadn't contacted to say farewell before succumbing to their illness within hours. The psychological explanations offered by mainstream science suggest these are manifestations of grief, anticipatory anxiety, or subconscious awareness of subtle signs communicated through letters or intuition. Yet none of these frameworks adequately address why the visions occur at such precise temporal moments, why they possess visual and auditory characteristics indistinguishable from reality, or why they frequently communicate information that could not have been known through conventional means. The phenomenon persists in modern times despite our sophisticated understanding of neurology and consciousness, with contemporary reports matching the patterns established centuries ago, and yet it remains largely absent from serious academic inquiry, relegated to the margins of parapsychology, where it awaits a framework capable of explaining how consciousness might transcend the physical constraints we assume to be absolute. Throughout documented human history, families have reported experiencing profound moments of connection at the precise instant a distant loved one passes away. Instances where individuals claim to have felt a sudden overwhelming presence, received an unexpected vision, or experienced an inexplicable emotional surge that later coincided with news of death. Phenomena that medical science has largely categorized as coincidence, yet continues to puzzle researchers who examine the statistical improbability of such occurrences. These telepathic farewell experiences often manifest as vivid dreams where the dying person appears unusually clear and present, or as spontaneous moments of acute anxiety followed by an uncanny calm, sensations that the experiencing individual cannot rationally explain but describe with striking consistency across cultures and centuries. The psychological framework most commonly applied to these phenomena involves the concept of emotional resonance and unconscious pattern recognition, suggesting that our minds, having spent years or decades in intimate connection with another person, may develop such finely tuned sensitivity to subtle environmental cues that we unconsciously detect minute changes in psychic pressure or electromagnetic fields that accompany major biological transitions. Though no reproducible mechanism for such detection has ever been scientifically validated. Furthermore, the retrospective nature of these reports introduces significant confirmation bias, as people naturally remember the instances when their premonitions aligned with actual death, while forgetting the countless false alarms and unexplained feelings that never materialized into tragedy. Among the most haunting deathbed phenomena documented by families and medical professionals alike is the inexplicable tendency of twins to die within hours or days of one another, even when separated by vast distances and unaware of their siblings' condition. Cases abound throughout medical literature of identical twins passing away simultaneously despite being in different hospitals, different cities, or even different countries, with no prior knowledge of the other's decline. One particularly striking account involves twins separated at birth who reunited in adulthood, only to experience cardiac events at precisely the same moment on opposite sides of a continent, with autopsy findings revealing nearly identical pathological conditions that should have been virtually impossible given their separate genetic and environmental histories. Families report receiving phone calls about one twin's death only moments after the other has expired, creating an eerie synchronicity that defies conventional explanation rooted in genetic predisposition or shared lifestyle factors. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon likely involves a combination of genetic vulnerability to identical conditions, unconscious psychosomatic responses to emotional distress, and the documented reality that twins often maintain heightened empathetic neural connections that can manifest as phantom pain or sensing when their sibling is in distress. Yet even when accounting for these biological and psychological factors, the precise temporal alignment of many cases remains statistically improbable and difficult to rationalize through standard medical frameworks. Modern medicine has essentially normalized twin death synchronicity by attributing it to genetic coincidence, while simultaneously struggling to explain why the timing so often appears deliberately orchestrated rather than randomly distributed. Throughout medical history and contemporary palliative care settings, there exists a documented phenomenon wherein long-married couples or deeply bonded partners experience death in remarkable temporal proximity to one another, sometimes within hours or days of a spouse's passing, despite having no shared medical condition or apparent physiological reason for simultaneous decline. Medical literature contains numerous case studies of individuals who were physically healthy, with no terminal diagnosis, yet died shortly after their partner's death, as though some invisible tether binding their life force had been severed. These instances occur across all age groups and health profiles, suggesting that the mechanism operates independently of conventional medical variables such as age, disease state, or pre-existing conditions. Family members and hospice workers report that in many cases, the surviving partner explicitly states they have no desire to continue living without their companion, and this psychological declaration sometimes precedes a rapid deterioration that confounds medical explanation, as the body appears to surrender in alignment with the mind's resignation. The phenomenon encompasses cases where individuals stop eating, lose will to engage in basic self-care, experience sudden cardiac events despite clear cardiac history, or simply fade away in a manner that pathologists struggle to categorize into standard diagnoses. Neurologically and psychologically, researchers have proposed that the loss of a lifelong partner triggers profound disruption in the brain's reward pathways, stress regulation systems, and the neural architecture that has been shaped by decades of intimate companionship. Yet this understanding does not fully account for the speed or certainty with which some individuals decline. The autonomic nervous system may respond to overwhelming grief with cascade failures, immune function may collapse under existential despair, or the body's will to maintain homeostasis may simply cease when the emotional foundation supporting it has been removed. Among the most persistent and emotionally compelling reports from those approaching death are vivid dreams in which deceased loved ones appear to offer comfort, guidance, or farewell. Experiences that occur with striking frequency across cultures and throughout recorded history, yet remain fundamentally inexplicable within our current understanding of consciousness and neurology. Families consistently report that dying relatives describe encounters with departed spouses, parents, or children in dreams so vivid and emotionally resonant that they feel qualitatively different from ordinary dreams, often leaving the dying person transformed, peaceful, and suddenly accepting of their imminent passing, as though some profound communication has taken place beyond the reach of medical instruments or rational explanation. These visitations typically occur in the days or hours before death, when medication, illness, and neurological decline would theoretically impair rather than enhance the clarity and emotional impact of dream experiences, yet the accounts suggest the opposite phenomenon entirely. The standard psychological explanation suggests that the dying brain, flooded with endorphins and faced with existential anxiety, unconsciously constructs comforting scenarios as a coping mechanism, essentially manufacturing these encounters as a merciful neurological defense against fear and pain. Yet this framework struggles to account for the specificity of details that dreamers report, the consistent accounts across people who have no shared knowledge of such experiences, and the profound behavioral changes that follow these dreams, suggesting something more substantial than mere neurological comfort fiction. In the final moments before death, and in some cases even after the heart has ceased to beat, medical professionals have documented unusual and unexplained surges of electrical activity within the human brain, phenomena that challenge our conventional understanding of consciousness and neurological function. These post-mortem brain surges have been observed during resuscitation attempts, in patients declared clinically dead, and even minutes after cardiac arrest when all measurable signs of life have apparently vanished. Yet electroencephalogram readings suddenly spike with intense, coordinated neural firing patterns that resemble the electrical signatures of conscious thought and sensory processing. Researchers monitoring these events have noted that the surges often display organized structure rather than the chaotic degradation expected from a dying brain, with waves of activity propagating across multiple regions in synchronized patterns that suggest some form of unified neural coordination is still occurring despite the absence of blood flow, oxygen delivery, and all other biological markers of life. The mechanism behind these mysterious surges remains fundamentally unexplained, as current neuroscientific models cannot adequately account for organized brain activity without metabolic energy production, which ceases almost immediately upon circulation failure, yet these surges persist and sometimes intensify, as if the brain is experiencing heightened rather than diminished function in its final instance. This paradox has led some researchers to speculate about alternative energy processes, quantum biological phenomena, or organizational principles of consciousness that operate independently of conventional metabolic requirements, though such theories remain highly controversial and largely untested. In the final moments before death, and remarkably in the hours immediately following the cessation of all brain activity, researchers have documented unusual spikes in gamma wave frequencies emanating from the brains of deceased individuals, a phenomenon that challenges our fundamental understanding of neurological function and the irreversibility of death itself. Gamma waves, which operate at frequencies above 30 Hz and are typically associated with conscious awareness, cognitive processing, and the binding of sensory information into unified experience, have been detected in multiple documented cases of brain-dead patients, sometimes with greater intensity than during their living states, suggesting that some form of electrical activity persists in neural tissue long after the heart has stopped and oxygen has ceased to flow through the cerebral vasculature. In one particularly striking case, a patient declared clinically dead exhibited a sustained burst of coordinated gamma activity across multiple brain regions for approximately 18 minutes after life support was withdrawn, a duration and intensity that neurophysiologists found impossible to reconcile with the known metabolic collapse of brain cells deprived of oxygen and glucose. The mechanism behind this phenomenon remains profoundly mysterious, as conventional neuroscience teaches us that neurons require continuous aerobic respiration to maintain the ionic gradients necessary for electrical firing. Yet these gamma oscillations appear to violate that principle entirely, suggesting either unknown biological processes capable of generating electrical activity without metabolic input or the presence of some alternative energy source within neural tissue that science has not yet identified or validated. When the heart stops beating, the brain should enter immediate darkness, Yet countless patients who have been resuscitated report extraordinarily vivid memories of events occurring during their clinical death, moments when their vital signs flatlined and electrical activity in the brain theoretically ceased to exist, and yet they claim conscious awareness persisted, describing with remarkable precision the layout of the resuscitation room, the exact words spoken by medical personnel. The procedures performed upon their bodies, and sometimes even events occurring in adjacent rooms or hallways where they had no physical vantage point, details that medical staff subsequently confirmed were entirely accurate despite the patients having been unconscious and receiving medications that would induce amnesia. The scientific explanation traditionally offered for this phenomenon invokes residual neural activity occurring in isolated pockets of the brain, suggesting that certain regions might retain metabolic function for seconds after cardiac arrest begins, creating a window of time during which fragmented sensory processing could theoretically occur. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the coherence and clarity of these accounts. The organizational quality of memory formation under such extreme physiological stress, or the demonstrable accuracy of observations that should have been impossible to acquire from a prone, unconscious body in surgical circumstances. Neuroscientists propose that the brain may undergo a final cascade of neurochemical activity, a surge of endogenous compounds that could heighten perception in the moments before true unconsciousness arrives. Yet the timing of when this surge would occur relative to consciousness itself remains scientifically elusive, and the mechanism by which memory could be encoded during such catastrophic neural dysfunction contradicts much of what we understand about the biological requirements for memory formation. During the final moments before death, thousands of individuals have reported experiencing what researchers call life review flashes, sudden and vivid recollections of significant events from their entire existence that appear to compress years of memory into seconds or minutes of conscious awareness. These accounts describe not merely passive remembering, but rather a kind of panoramic reliving in which the dying person witnesses their own life events with complete sensory detail, emotional intensity, and often a profound sense of narrative coherence, as though their existence has been reassembled into a coherent story just as consciousness begins to slip away. Cardiologists, neurologists, and intensive care nurses have documented thousands of such reports from patients who have nearly died or recovered from clinical death, and the consistency across cultures, ages, and backgrounds remains striking despite the neurological chaos that should accompany oxygen deprivation to the brain. The conventional explanation suggests that as neurons begin to misfire during hypoxia and the dying brain releases massive quantities of neurotransmitters in a final cascade, these random neural discharges somehow activate memory pathways in a way that feels organized and meaningful to the experiencing consciousness, a kind of neurochemical seizure that the mind interprets as autobiographical narrative. Yet this explanation struggles against substantial complications. Patients report not confused fragmentation, but rather exquisite clarity and purpose in their visions. They describe emotional synthesis and moral reckoning rather than random image flashing, and many describe witnessing events they had consciously forgotten or never consciously known, raising questions about how the dying brain could reconstruct information it no longer actively stored. Among the most perplexing deathbed phenomena documented by researchers and clinicians is a state known as timeless awareness, wherein individuals approaching the end of life report experiencing a collapse of temporal perception, describing moments that feel simultaneously instantaneous and eternal, compressed yet boundless, a paradoxical sensation that defies the ordinary human experience of time passing in linear sequence. Patients in this state have described reviewing their entire lives in what they perceive as a single moment, witnessing their birth and death and every significant event between them all at once, without the sequential processing that normally characterizes consciousness, yet simultaneously feeling as though they have been experiencing these moments for an immeasurable duration that transcends hours or days or years. Neurologically, this phenomenon presents a profound puzzle, as the human brain relies upon the temporal lobe and various memory systems to construct our sense of sequential time. And yet, in these deathbed moments, individuals report accessing their complete autobiographical memory instantaneously while feeling no contradiction between the brevity and the infinity of the experience. Some researchers have proposed that as the dying brain experiences metabolic failure and shifts in neurotransmitter balance, the normal temporal processing systems may degrade in ways that allow the brain to access memories simultaneously rather than sequentially, creating a subjective sense of timelessness. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the phenomenological reports of perfect clarity and profound meaning that accompany these experiences rather than the confusion or fragmentation one might expect from neural degradation. Throughout recorded history, individuals facing imminent death or extreme life-threatening situations have reported an uncanny phenomenon: the sudden appearance of a protective, guiding presence that exists only in their perception, a figure commonly referred to as the third man factor. This entity materializes during moments of profound crisis, near-fatal mountaineering expeditions, plane crashes, shipwrecks, and medical emergencies, and invariably acts to calm, reassure, or guide the dying person toward survival or acceptance. Ernest Shackleton's legendary Antarctic expedition provides perhaps the most famous documented account, where the explorer and his two companions, facing certain death on the ice, reported sensing an additional presence accompanying their group, a fourth entity that offered them comfort and direction until rescue arrived. Similar accounts emerge from survivors of cardiac arrest, drowning incidents, and combat zones, where individuals describe being approached by a luminous figure, a deceased loved one, or simply an overwhelming sense of benevolent companionship that arrives precisely when psychological or physical resources have become depleted. Scientists initially attributed these experiences to oxygen deprivation in the brain, the release of endorphins, or the mind's desperate creation of a coping mechanism in response to terminal distress. However, the consistency and specificity of these reports across vastly different cultures, time periods, and physiological circumstances have resisted simple neurological explanation. The figure typically possesses distinct characteristics. It communicates wordlessly through pure understanding, it offers information the dying person could not possibly know, and it demonstrates apparent independence from the sufferer's conscious thoughts or expectations. Among the most profoundly unsettling deathbed phenomena documented by medical professionals and hospice workers are the remarkably consistent visions reported by dying children, who frequently describe encounters with deceased relatives, luminous figures, or comforting presences during their final hours or days, often with a clarity and specificity that seems incongruous with their developmental stage and limited life experience. These accounts emerge with surprising regularity across different cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, and religious traditions, with children as young as 3 or 4 years old providing detailed descriptions of beings they claim to recognize despite having no prior exposure to them, sometimes identifying deceased grandparents they never met or relatives who had passed before their birth. Medical science has attempted to attribute these experiences to hypoxia, medication effects, or the brain's natural response to severe physiological stress. Yet these explanations struggle to account for the consistent phenomenological content of such visions, the children's apparent lucidity during the experiences, or the profound sense of peace and recognition that typically accompanies them rather than the confusion or distress that would logically result from oxygen deprivation. Neurologically, we understand that the dying brain undergoes significant chemical changes, with endorphin release and altered neurotransmitter activity potentially creating hallucinatory states. Yet this mechanistic framework fails to explain why children across vastly different circumstances would report nearly identical encounters, or why these visions so consistently feature figures of comfort rather than nightmarish or random imagery as would be expected from purely pathological brain activity. Among the most perplexing deathbed phenomena documented by medical professionals and family members alike is the moment when a dying person suddenly becomes animated and begins describing encounters with relatives whom they claim to recognize, yet who are entirely unknown to the attending family members, sometimes ancestors who died decades or even centuries before the patient was born. These visions often follow a remarkably consistent pattern. The dying individual speaks with certainty and clarity about specific family members, sometimes describing their appearance in detail, their relationship to the family, or events from their lives that the patient could not possibly have known through conventional means. Families report that these moments frequently involve the patient becoming visibly calm or joyful, as though they have received a welcome and expected visitation, and in many cases, the patient will insist that these relatives have come to escort them into whatever lies beyond consciousness. The phenomenon is particularly striking when multiple family members are present who can confirm that the patient has indeed described individuals whose existence they themselves were unaware of, only to later verify through family records or genealogical research that these people were genuine ancestors whose names and histories match the patient's descriptions with uncanny accuracy. From a conventional medical perspective, such experiences are typically attributed to hypoxia of the brain, medication effects, or the dreamlike state that precedes death, wherein the mind might construct narratives from fragmented memories or cultural expectations absorbed throughout a lifetime. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the specificity of the identifications, the emotional recognition displayed by the dying person, or the cases in which the patient describes relatives unknown to their entire immediate family, information that could not have been stored in memory or imagination. Among the most poignant and perplexing deathbed phenomena documented by medical professionals and grief counselors is the recurring report of dying individuals claiming to see, hear, or sense the presence of deceased pets, often beloved companions from years or even decades past. These accounts come from patients across all age groups and cultural backgrounds, describing vivid encounters with animals that had died long before the patient's own terminal illness began, yet somehow appear at the moment of death as though summoned by an invisible force to guide their human companion across an unknown threshold. Some patients reach out to touch pets that are no longer there, their hands moving through empty air with unmistakable recognition and comfort, while others speak to animals by name, recounting specific memories or mannerisms that only they could know, displaying a clarity and presence that seems incongruous with their failing bodies. Family members frequently report feeling genuine uncertainty about whether the patient is hallucinating or genuinely perceiving something beyond the veil of ordinary reality, particularly when the dying person provides details about the deceased animal that had been forgotten by everyone present, or when multiple witnesses observe the patient's behavior shifting inexplicably in response to an empty space. The psychological explanation for these encounters centers on the concept of anticipatory grief and the brain's tendency to summon powerful emotional anchors during moments of profound transition and fear. As consciousness begins its final dissolution, the dying mind may regress towards sources of unconditional comfort and safety from earlier life experiences, and for many people, their pets represented precisely such comfort, relationships uncomplicated by the social pressures and emotional complexity that human relationships often entail. Throughout documented deathbed accounts spanning centuries and across diverse cultures, witnesses have reported observing unexplained luminous figures appearing at the moment of death or in the hours preceding it, phenomena that cannot be readily attributed to conventional light sources, reflections, or the medical equipment commonly present in hospital environments. These luminous forms are frequently described as distinctly humanoid in shape, sometimes appearing as glowing silhouettes, radiant orbs of light, or ethereal figures that seem to emanate their own luminescence independent of external illumination, often hovering near the dying person's bedside or hovering above their body at the precise moment life appears to cease. Medical professionals and family members present during these episodes report that the luminosity is often visible to multiple observers simultaneously, suggesting it is not purely a subjective hallucination confined to a single individual's perception. Yet standard scientific instruments placed in these rooms have consistently failed to detect measurable electromagnetic radiation, unusual photon emissions, or any identifiable physical source capable of producing such visual phenomena. The psychological explanation commonly offered suggests that grief, emotional distress, and the heightened neurological state of those present create visual pareidolia, wherein the human brain spontaneously imposes meaningful patterns onto ambiguous visual information, or that the bereaved unconsciously project their expectations and spiritual beliefs onto shadows, reflections, or the natural luminescence of dying tissue experiencing chemical changes. Yet this explanation proves insufficient to account for the remarkable consistency of these reports across radically different geographical regions, religious traditions, and historical periods where modern psychology and neuroscience would have been entirely unknown to the observers documenting these experiences. Among the most documented accounts in near-death experience literature exists a peculiar phenomenon wherein individuals who have ostensibly crossed the threshold of death report being consciously redirected back toward their bodies, as though by an external force or intelligence, often accompanied by a sense of purpose unfulfilled or tasks remaining incomplete in the material world. These individuals describe encountering barriers of light, encountering presences that communicate wordlessly yet unmistakably, or experiencing an abrupt reversal of the dying process itself, where consciousness snaps back into flesh with jarring intensity, and they suddenly find themselves gasping in hospital beds or resuscitation areas, fully aware of the transition that has just occurred. The consistency of these accounts across different cultures, religions, time periods, and demographic groups is striking, suggesting either a universal neurological phenomenon or something more difficult to categorize within our current scientific framework. Psychologically, these experiences have been attributed to the brain's final surge of activity, a last cascade of neurotransmitters creating vivid hallucinations of separation and return. Yet this explanation does not adequately account for the specificity of details these patients report, the organized narratives they construct, or the profound transformations in worldview and behavior that persistently follow such encounters. The mechanism by which a dying brain might construct the sensation of being actively sent backward, of encountering resistance or decision-making from an external source, remains unexplained by current models of consciousness and neural activity during cardiac arrest or clinical death. Among the most consistently reported phenomena in deathbed accounts is the perception of a distinct boundary or threshold that the dying person appears to approach but cannot cross, a liminal space described as neither fully in the world of the living nor completely in whatever lies beyond. Individuals in the final moments frequently describe seeing or sensing an invisible demarcation line, a wall of light, a doorway, a river, or an architectural structure like a gate or fence that separates them from deceased loved ones or spiritual entities on the other side. The dying person often expresses a sense of hesitation at this boundary, sometimes reaching toward it without passing through, sometimes being held back by unseen forces or their own uncertainty about whether crossing is permitted. Family members present during these episodes report that their dying relatives seem to be communicating with an invisible presence just beyond reach, speaking to it as though held in conversation across some impassable divide. The description of this barrier appears across centuries of documented cases, religious traditions, and cultural boundaries with remarkable consistency, suggesting either a shared psychological construct or a genuinely perceived phenomenon that the human mind encounters at the threshold of death. One possible explanation involves the brain's final attempts to maintain cognitive boundaries and spatial awareness as neural systems begin to fail, creating a literal interpretation of the metaphorical boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness. The barrier might represent the mind's last organized thought pattern before the dissolution of self, a final framework through which the dying brain categorizes the incomprehensible sensations of death. Yet what persists in these accounts is not merely a neurological glitch, but rather the profound meaning that those experiencing it ascribe to the barrier, as though it represents an actual choice point, a moment of final hesitation before an irrevocable transition that the consciousness somehow recognizes but cannot fully comprehend. Among the most consistently reported phenomena during near-death experiences stands the vision of a tunnel, typically described as a dark passage that gradually brightens toward a luminous opening, often accompanied by the sensation of rapid movement or being pulled forward through absolute darkness into overwhelming brilliance. Thousands of individuals who have survived cardiac arrest, severe trauma, or clinical death have reported this singular experience with remarkable similarity, describing feelings of peace and inevitability as they traverse this mysterious conduit toward what many interpret as an otherworldly destination. The tunnel itself is reported to feel distinctly real, not dreamlike or hallucinatory, with witnesses often expressing profound conviction about the authenticity of what they perceived, insisting that no waking experience could compare to the vividness and dimensionality of the phenomenon. Medical science has proposed several explanations for this widespread hallucination, suggesting that oxygen deprivation to the visual cortex creates tunnel vision as peripheral sight fails first while central vision persists momentarily. or that the brain's dying neurons fire in patterns that generate the sensation of light and movement. Alternatively, some neurologists propose that endorphins released during extreme stress create a euphoric state that the brain interprets as a luminous passage, or that the retinal cells themselves respond to oxygen depletion by generating phosphenes, those ghostly lights visible when pressure is applied to closed eyes. Yet despite these logical frameworks, the tunnel phenomenon persists as genuinely inexplicable in crucial respects, because it appears across cultures and historical periods where such medical terminology would be unknown, because the consistency of reports exceeds what random neural firing would suggest, and because many experiencers report encounters with deceased relatives or spiritual entities within these tunnels that somehow conveyed specific information they later verified. Throughout medical history, physicians and family members have documented a striking and recurrent phenomenon in the final hours or days of terminal patients: a sudden and profound disappearance of fear, anxiety, and existential dread that had previously dominated the individual's psychological state. Patients who spent months or even years expressing terror about their approaching death, who lay awake at night consumed by worry about the dying process itself, about pain, about leaving loved ones behind, or about what might come after life ends, sometimes experience an inexplicable shift in which all of that fear simply vanishes, replaced by a calm acceptance or even a serene readiness that observers describe as almost otherworldly in its completeness. Family members report sitting with dying relatives who suddenly seem at peace in a way they have never been in life, speaking softly about their readiness to go, expressing gratitude and love, and displaying a centered tranquility that stands in stark contrast to the agitation and worry of previous weeks. Medical staff in hospice and palliative care settings encounter this phenomenon with enough regularity that many experienced nurses develop an intuition that such sudden fearlessness often precedes death by only hours or days, as if some internal mechanism recognizes the proximity of the end and fundamentally alters the emotional landscape of the dying person's consciousness. The conventional psychological explanation suggests that this might represent a final neurological shift, perhaps a release of endogenous opioids, a reduction in cortisol, or a cascade of neurochemical changes that naturally occur as the body's systems begin to fail, thereby producing a genuine sense of chemical peace independent of the person's actual circumstances. Others propose that the mind, when faced with the absolute certainty and imminence of death, simply exhausts its capacity for denial and resistance, and in that exhaustion finds an unexpected freedom, a kind of existential surrender that paradoxically brings comfort rather than despair. In the final hours before death, medical professionals and family members have documented countless cases in which terminally ill patients experience profound states of euphoria, inexplicable joy, and overwhelming peace, despite their physical deterioration and psychological awareness of their impending mortality. These moments often arrive suddenly, without pharmaceutical intervention, without any change in medical treatment, and sometimes even in patients who have spent weeks or months in states of depression, anxiety, or existential despair. Nurses working in hospice settings describe witnessing patients who moments earlier were expressing fear or pain suddenly smile, with a radiance that seems disconnected from their circumstances, speaking of beauty they perceive around them, or expressing feelings of reunion with deceased loved ones. The intensity of this euphoria cannot be easily dismissed as mere pain medication, as it frequently occurs in patients on stable doses of their existing regimen, or in some cases in patients who have specifically refused additional medication. Medical science has attempted to explain this phenomenon through various neurological mechanisms, suggesting that the dying brain may experience a final cascade of endorphins, a last-minute surge of internal opioids released as a protective mechanism against suffering, much as the body might release these same chemicals during extreme physical trauma. Some researchers propose that oxygen deprivation to certain brain regions, particularly those governing fear and anxiety, might paradoxically create these states of contentment by literally disabling the neural pathways responsible for distress. Yet despite these mechanistic explanations, the phenomenon persists as genuinely inexplicable because the euphoria often appears too organized, too specific, too seemingly aware to be merely the random firing of a dying nervous system. Families report that patients speak coherently during these states, recognize loved ones with clear consciousness, and describe their experiences in ways that suggest intentional communication rather than delirious hallucination. Among the most striking observations documented by hospice workers, palliative care nurses, and family members attending to the dying is a phenomenon so consistent yet so puzzling that it remains largely absent from mainstream medical literature: the sudden and complete disappearance of chronic pain in the final hours or days of life, occurring without any pharmaceutical intervention whatsoever. Patients who have endured years or decades of severe pain from cancer, arthritis, neuropathy, or degenerative disease conditions often experience an abrupt cessation of suffering that defies conventional medical explanation. A woman who has lived with metastatic cancer pain for months, requiring escalating doses of morphine and additional analgesics, may suddenly report that her pain has entirely vanished, allowing her to spend her final conscious hours in comfort and clarity despite receiving no additional medication or even reduced dosages. Family members describe the visible transformation: the relaxation of facial muscles, the softening of the body, the return of peaceful breathing patterns that had been disrupted by years of protective tension against chronic discomfort. Medical professionals have proposed various mechanisms to explain this phenomenon, attributing it to endogenous opioid release, the brain's final shutdown of pain processing systems, or the body's evolutionary preparation for death that may involve natural analgesia. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the timing, the completeness, or the consistency of the experience. The psychological component cannot be entirely separated from the biological, as the acceptance of approaching death, the resolution of emotional conflicts, or the achievement of spiritual peace may interact with neurological processes in ways we do not yet understand, creating a synergistic effect that medical science struggles to quantify or replicate. In hospices and hospitals around the world, medical professionals have documented a curious and consistent phenomenon where patients in their final days or hours begin to display an acute awareness of their impending death, often coupled with the ability to predict the exact timing of their own passing with startling accuracy. Patients who had been unconscious or heavily sedated sometimes suddenly awaken with complete clarity, sit upright in bed, and calmly inform their families that they will die within the next few hours or at a specific time of day, and then proceed to do exactly that, as though they possess some internal biological clock counting down to their final moments. Families report that these patients become unusually lucid and peaceful, sometimes describing visions of deceased loved ones waiting for them, or expressing a sense of completion and readiness that transcends any rational explanation based on medical deterioration or medication levels. The phenomenon occurs across different cultures, religions, and belief systems, suggesting it is not simply a learned behavior or cultural expectation, but rather something more fundamental to the human experience at the threshold of death. Medical researchers have attempted to explain nearing-death awareness through various psychological mechanisms, including the brain's release of endorphins and other neurochemicals that might create a sense of profound peace and altered perception, or the possibility that patients are merely reading subtle changes in their own bodies or interpreting the tension they observe in their family's behavior. Yet these explanations fail to account for the specificity of the predictions, the cases where patients have accurately announced deaths at precise times despite having no conscious access to medical information or their own vital signs, or the instances where bedridden and isolated patients have spoken of seeing people they had no way of knowing had recently died. In the final hours of life, numerous witnesses have reported that dying individuals begin to speak in what can only be described as a metaphorical language of travel and departure, using geographical and directional references that seem disconnected from their immediate surroundings, and yet profoundly consistent across cultures and time periods. Patients who have been bedridden for months will suddenly ask about catching trains that are not in the station, inquire whether the car is ready for a long journey, or speak of needing to pack their belongings for an important trip they must take, and these utterances are delivered with a clarity and purposefulness that stands in sharp contrast to the confusion and delirium that often characterize the end stages of terminal illness. Family members report that despite being surrounded by familiar furniture and loved ones, the dying person seems to perceive themselves as being in transit, at a threshold, or preparing for passage to somewhere else entirely, and they frequently direct questions and comments toward invisible companions or figures who appear, in their perception, to be facilitating this departure or waiting to receive them at some distant destination. The conventional medical explanation attributes these phenomena to the effects of hypoxia, medication, and the deterioration of cognitive function, suggesting that the brain, when starved of oxygen and flooded with certain neurochemicals, generates hallucinations and confused speech that merely coincides with death. Yet what remains difficult to reconcile within this framework is the remarkable coherence, consistency, and universal nature of the travel metaphor itself. Why, across entirely different cultures, religious backgrounds, and linguistic traditions, would the dying brain independently converge on nearly identical symbolic language of journeys and departures, unless there existed some deeper neurological or transcendent commonality in the dying experience itself? Among the most perplexing deathbed phenomena documented by hospice workers and family members is the recurring request for tickets, a phrase uttered by the dying that defies straightforward interpretation and has puzzled medical professionals for decades. The dying individual, often lucid moments before or sometimes in states of semi-consciousness, will suddenly ask for tickets to an unnamed destination, request that someone bring them tickets, or express urgent concern about whether their tickets have been acquired, sometimes becoming distressed if the request cannot be immediately fulfilled. These individuals speak of the tickets with the same practical urgency one might reserve for travel arrangements or event admissions, suggesting in their minds a genuine need to procure passage somewhere, though they rarely specify exactly where these tickets might lead or what mode of transportation they envision. Family members report instances where elderly patients have asked about train tickets, theater tickets, or simply generic admission passes, sometimes in voices that carry unusual clarity compared to their degraded state moments before or after the request. The phenomenon appears across cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds, documented by medical anthropologists and hospice nurses with sufficient frequency to merit serious consideration rather than dismissal as mere delirium. One might propose that the request emerges from fragmented memories or dreamlike states characteristic of the dying brain, where metaphorical language bleeds into literal requests, where the unconscious mind attempts to process the journey ahead through familiar symbolic vocabulary. The tickets in this framework might represent passage into whatever lies beyond, a final earthly transaction that grants permission to depart, a recognition that one cannot simply leave without proper authorization or documentation. Among the most peculiar and undocumented phenomena observed in end-of-life care is the behavior known as packing for a journey, wherein terminally ill patients, particularly those in advanced stages of cognitive decline or approaching the final hours of consciousness, begin to exhibit deliberate and purposeful movements suggestive of preparing for travel, despite their complete physical inability to leave their beds or their documented lack of awareness regarding their actual circumstances. Caregivers and medical staff report witnessing patients who have not spoken coherently in days suddenly becoming animated and focused, their trembling hands moving through the air in specific patterns that mimic folding clothing, arranging possessions, or fastening bags, their eyes tracking invisible objects across empty space with remarkable concentration and intent. Some patients vocalize during these episodes, asking family members to help them pack, insisting that they must catch a train or plane at a specific time, demonstrating a temporal urgency that seems divorced entirely from the reality of their immobile physical state. The phenomenon appears across cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds, suggesting it is not learned behavior or the product of specific belief systems, yet it remains largely unexamined by modern neuroscience and psychology. Neurologically, these actions cannot easily be explained as mere spasms or involuntary movements, as they display too much purposefulness and directional logic to be random neural firing, and they often persist even when patients are administered sedative medications that should suppress such activity. The psychological interpretation has typically defaulted to metaphorical thinking, suggesting patients are unconsciously preparing themselves for death, conceptualized as a journey or transition, perhaps drawing upon deeply embedded cultural or religious symbolism about the afterlife as a destination requiring preparation. Yet this explanation remains largely speculative and cannot account for the specificity of the behaviors or the degree of apparent consciousness these episodes seem to display. In countless hospitals, hospices, and homes around the world, medical professionals and family members have documented a phenomenon that occurs with striking regularity in the final hours of life. The dying person extends their arm or hand toward empty space, sometimes with urgency, sometimes with profound gentleness, as though greeting or reaching for someone who stands invisibly before them. The gesture is often accompanied by expressions of recognition, peace, or occasionally distress, and the person seems entirely convinced of the presence they perceive, even when surrounded only by bewildered loved ones and medical staff. This behavior transcends culture, geography, and religious background, suggesting something more universal than mere hallucination or delirium. Yet modern neuroscience struggles to explain why a failing brain would generate such consistent, purposeful, and emotionally coherent visions at the moment of death, rather than the chaotic or fragmented imagery we might expect from organ shutdown. One framework posits that hypoxia and the cascade of chemical changes occurring as the brain begins to die might trigger the limbic system in ways that produce vivid sensory experiences. Perhaps the brain's own filing system, retrieving emotionally significant memories or archetypes from a lifetime of human connection. Others suggest that the reaching gesture itself may represent something neurologically primitive, a reflexive movement tied to evolutionary survival instincts rather than genuine perception of another entity. Yet what remains persistently unexplained is not merely the mechanism of these visions, but their remarkable consistency in content and emotional tone across individuals who could not have coordinated their experiences, and the fact that dying people demonstrate absolute conviction about whom they are perceiving, often naming specific deceased relatives or recognizing their presence without hesitation or doubt. As though the boundary between this world and another has momentarily become permeable in the neurological landscape of the departing consciousness. In hospices and hospitals around the world, medical professionals and family members have documented a recurring phenomenon in the final moments of human life. The tendency of dying individuals to fix their gaze upward, often with an intensity and steadiness that seems to defy the muscular deterioration occurring throughout their bodies. The eyes, which moments before may have been half closed or dim with the approaching end of consciousness, suddenly open and direct themselves toward the ceiling or a point above the faces of those gathered around the bed, remaining fixed in that position, sometimes for hours before death occurs. This phenomenon transcends cultures, religions, and belief systems, appearing with remarkable consistency across different populations and geographical regions, suggesting something universal about the human experience at life's threshold. Family members describe the experience as profoundly moving and unsettling simultaneously, noting that the dying person's gaze seems focused on something specific, something beyond the material room, with a clarity and intention that stands in stark contrast to the confusion or diminished awareness that may have characterized earlier stages of their decline. Medical explanations typically attribute this to simple neurological processes, the relaxation of certain eye muscles as the brain loses control, or the natural tendency of the eyes to drift upward as consciousness fades, a phenomenon documented in cases of severe anesthesia and coma states. Yet this clinical interpretation often fails to satisfy observers who witness the phenomenon directly, for the quality of the gaze frequently appears too deliberate, too purposeful, and too sustained to be merely the product of random muscular relaxation. The eyes do not flutter or move aimlessly, they fix and hold, sometimes accompanied by subtle changes in facial expression that suggest recognition or comprehension rather than vacant shutdown. In hospices and hospitals across the world, medical professionals and family members witness a phenomenon so consistent it has become almost expected, yet remains fundamentally inexplicable: the sudden, unmistakable smile that appears on the faces of the dying in their final moments or hours. This is not a grimace born of pain, nor a reflexive muscular contraction, but what observers describe as a genuine, peaceful expression of contentment or recognition. Patients who have been unconscious for days, who have shown no facial movement or acknowledgement of their surroundings, will sometimes experience a visible brightening of the face, accompanied by a gentle upturning of the mouth and softening of the eyes. Family members report that these smiles often feel intentional, as though the dying person is communicating something profound that language can no longer convey. In some cases, the smile appears moments before death arrives, suggesting that whatever transition is occurring has brought not dread, but something approaching relief or even joy. Neurologically, we might attempt to explain this through the release of endorphins as the body shuts down, or perhaps through the activation of certain brain regions that generate pleasurable sensations in response to the dying process. Yet these explanations remain speculative and incomplete, unable to account for the specificity of the phenomenon or the consistency with which observers recognize it as something other than mere biological happenstance. What makes this experience particularly challenging to reconcile with our current scientific understanding is that it occurs regardless of the patient's level of consciousness, their religious beliefs, their cultural background, or the circumstances of their dying. The smile persists in our cultural memory and medical literature precisely because it suggests that the final moments of human existence might contain an experience that transcends suffering, that offers something we cannot yet measure or understand, and that our scientific frameworks have not yet found a way to fully acknowledge or explain. Across medical wards and hospice facilities worldwide, caregivers and physicians have documented a profoundly consistent phenomenon. As death approaches, patients who have not spoken coherently in days or weeks suddenly call out for their mothers, often by name, with striking clarity and emotional intensity. A man in his 70s who has been largely unresponsive for 72 hours suddenly opens his eyes and cries, "Mother, where are you?" A woman in her 80s, whose speech has been reduced to unintelligible murmurs for a week, suddenly articulates a clear, desperate plea for her mother, who passed away decades earlier. This phenomenon transcends cultural boundaries, socioeconomic status, and religious background, occurring with such regularity that it has become almost expected in end-of-life care settings, yet its underlying mechanism remains fundamentally unexplained by modern neuroscience and psychology. The standard medical interpretation suggests that as the brain deteriorates and consciousness fragments, patients regress to earlier psychological states, accessing deeply embedded childhood memories and maternal attachments that supersede present awareness. This regression hypothesis proposes that the dying mind strips away layers of adult cognition and personality, returning to the most fundamental emotional anchors of human existence, where the mother figure represents safety, comfort, and unconditional acceptance. Yet this explanation, while plausible on its surface, fails to account for several perplexing dimensions of the phenomenon. The remarkable lucidity with which these calls are made, the apparent purposefulness behind them, and the way they often occur even when the patient has suffered severe dementia or has been estranged from their mother for their entire adult lives. Among the most peculiar and recurring statements documented in hospice care and hospital death wards is the phrase, "I'm going home," spoken by patients who are terminally ill, often in their final hours or days, despite the fact that they are already physically located in their home or in a medical facility that has become their residence for weeks or months. Nurses and family members across countless institutions report hearing these words with striking frequency, delivered with a tone of clarity and sometimes even relief, as though the speaker possesses knowledge of a destination that others cannot perceive. The patient's utterance is typically calm, matter-of-fact, and occasionally accompanied by references to deceased loved ones, a sense of peace, or descriptions of a place they do not name but seem to recognize with absolute certainty. What makes this phenomenon particularly difficult to dismiss is its consistency across cultures, religions, and generations. It appears in medical literature from diverse countries and socioeconomic backgrounds, suggesting it is not merely a product of shared cultural expectation or religious conditioning. The rational explanation might suggest that dying patients are experiencing confusion, regression to childhood homes, or that their brains are generating comforting metaphorical language in response to approaching death. Yet many patients who express this sentiment demonstrate clear consciousness, coherence, and an ability to distinguish between their current location and the home they speak of traveling toward, creating a gap between what neurological explanations can easily account for and what is actually being reported. Despite decades of palliative care research and advances in understanding end-of-life consciousness, the phenomenon persists as something we acknowledge, document, and ultimately normalize as part of dying, without achieving genuine understanding of what mechanism might generate such consistent, purposeful statements about journeys to unspecified destinations that feel, to the person experiencing them, profoundly real and imminent. Among the most striking and consistent deathbed phenomena documented by hospice workers and family members is the dying person's sudden, vivid ability to describe gardens they have never seen in their waking life. gardens that emerge in their speech with such anatomical precision and emotional resonance that observers struggle to explain the source of these descriptions. Patients in the final hours or days, many of whom have lost the capacity for coherent speech or complex thought, will suddenly articulate elaborate botanical details, describing specific flower arrangements, the texture of particular leaves, the exact angle of sunlight filtering through carefully positioned trees, sometimes naming plants in languages they never studied while in full consciousness. Witnesses report that these descriptions carry an uncanny quality of certainty, as though the dying person is not imagining or confabulating, but rather observing something present before them, and they speak with a clarity that often contrasts sharply with their deteriorated mental state moments before or after these episodes. The phenomenon appears across cultures and centuries, recurring in deathbed accounts from vastly different populations and time periods, suggesting something consistent in human neurology or consciousness during the approach of death. Neurologically, one might attribute such descriptions to the brain's final creative output as neural pathways degrade, perhaps conjuring vivid imagery from fragmented memories of gardens encountered in childhood or transmitted culturally. Yet this explanation strains credibility when considering the architectural coherence and botanical specificity of many accounts. Some researchers propose that the dying brain, freed from the filter of immediate sensory input and cognitive editing, may access deeper layers of memory or imagination with unprecedented vividness, much as dreams do in sleep, though why gardens specifically feature so prominently remains unclear. Across cultures and centuries, one recurring deathbed vision stands apart from the others, not because it is unprecedented or isolated, but because of its remarkable consistency and the profound sense of transition it conveys to those experiencing it, the image of crossing a river. Patients in their final moments, particularly in their last hours or days, have reported seeing themselves approaching a body of water, sometimes calm and reflective, other times turbulent and wide, and describe an overwhelming sensation of needing to cross it to reach the other side. Some report seeing figures waiting on the distant shore, beckoning them forward, while others describe the crossing itself as a solitary journey requiring courage or resolve. The river appears neither as a threat nor as an obstacle to be avoided, but rather as a necessary passage, a threshold that must be traversed to complete some essential transition. Many who report these visions express a strange familiarity with the crossing, as though they have always known this moment would come, and the river itself becomes the representation of that knowing. The psychological framework might suggest that the dying mind draws upon archetypal imagery stored in human consciousness, the river serving as a universal metaphor for change and boundary that transcends language and geography. Yet this explanation, while reasonable, does not account for the specificity of the vision, nor for the consistency with which it appears regardless of the individual's prior exposure to such mythology or their cultural context. The image persists in medical literature and near-death accounts without clear origin or mechanism, normalized through repetition into an accepted phenomenon rather than through any genuine understanding of why the dying brain produces this particular vision at this particular moment. One of the most peculiar and frequently reported deathbed phenomena involves the dying person suddenly sitting upright or becoming intensely alert while gazing fixedly toward a doorway, window, or specific threshold within their room, often accompanied by expressions of recognition, peace, or sometimes confusion that suggest they are perceiving something or someone that others in the room cannot see. Nurses and hospice workers have documented countless instances where patients in the final hours or minutes of life, sometimes after days of unconsciousness or unresponsiveness, will unexpectedly orient themselves toward a doorway with startling clarity and focus, their eyes tracking invisible presences as if following a person or entity moving through the space. Family members attending these deaths have reported feeling an uncanny shift in the room's atmosphere during these moments, describing sensations of coldness, pressure, or an inexplicable emotional weight that seems to emanate from the exact location toward which their dying loved one is gazing. The phenomenon often precedes death by minutes to hours, and in many cases, patients will extend their hands or speak in hushed, urgent tones directed at the threshold, sometimes addressing people by name or expressing sentiments that suggest recognition or reunion. Neurologically, we might attribute this to the brain's response to hypoxia and the misfiring of neural pathways as oxygen deprivation intensifies, or to the release of endogenous compounds during the dying process that could produce hallucinations or altered perceptions. The doorway itself may represent a symbolic threshold between consciousness and unconsciousness, between life and death, which the dying mind interprets as a literal portal or boundary that requires attention. Yet despite these rational frameworks, the specificity and consistency of these reports across cultures, time periods, and diverse religious and secular populations remains striking, suggesting either a universal neurological response that manifests in this particular way, or something that conventional neuroscience has not yet adequately explained. Throughout recorded history and across countless cultures, families separated by great distances have reported experiencing sudden, overwhelming sensations of dread, sorrow, or inexplicable emotional disturbance at the precise moment a distant relative has died, often before any communication or notification could possibly have reached them through conventional means. A daughter working in another country suddenly feels compelled to call her aging father, only to learn moments later that he has just passed away in a hospital hundreds of miles away. A sister wakes from sleep gasping for breath at 3 in the morning, seized by panic and inexplicable grief, and within hours discovers that her brother died in an accident at that very moment. These accounts are not isolated incidents confined to superstitious populations or unverified anecdotes whispered in darkness, but rather widespread reports documented across medical literature, grief counseling records, and personal testimonies from people of all educational and socioeconomic backgrounds. The mechanism proposed by conventional psychology suggests that these experiences might be explained through unconscious perception of subtle environmental cues, prior anxiety about an aging relative's health, or the power of coincidence combined with selective memory, where we remember the hits and forget the countless times we felt inexplicably sad and nothing happened. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the specificity of these experiences, the precise timing that seems far too exact to be mere chance, or the cases where individuals claim to have felt something completely unusual and unprecedented in their lives. What remains striking is how thoroughly normalized this phenomenon has become within our cultural consciousness, how readily families accept these stories as simply another aspect of losing someone we love deeply, neither fully explained nor fully questioned, simply accepted as one more mystery that sits at the boundary between the physical world we understand and the interior landscape of human connection that continues to elude our complete comprehension. Among the most haunting and persistent reports from those attending to the dying are instances of unexpected telephone calls arriving at the moment of death or in the hours immediately preceding it, calls that originate from the deceased person themselves or from unknown numbers that leave no trace in phone records, or that connect callers to voices of loved ones who have already passed away weeks or months prior. Families have documented numerous cases where a person in their final moments suddenly receives a call from a relative they were thinking of, only to learn moments later that the relative died at that exact instant in a distant location, with no possible way the call could have been made through conventional telecommunications infrastructure. Other accounts describe receiving calls from the hospital phone of a deceased loved 1 hour after that person had expired, or answering calls in which the voice on the other end claims to be calling from beyond, speaking with clarity and familiarity before the connection dissolves into static or silence. The psychological mechanisms that might explain these phenomena are rooted in our profound need for closure and connection with the dying, our tendency to pattern match coincidences into meaningful narratives, and our susceptibility to misremembering timestamps and details during periods of extreme emotional distress. Grief and heightened awareness during deathbed vigils can sharpen our perception while simultaneously distorting our memory of events, creating what researchers call temporal compression, where multiple separate incidents blur into a single remarkable memory. Yet despite our understanding of how grief and stress reshape perception, these accounts persist with remarkable consistency across cultures and generations, suggesting that whether the phenomenon is objectively real or subjectively constructed, it fulfills a profound human need to believe that death does not entirely sever our connections to those we love most. Across hospitals, care facilities, and private homes, there exists a recurring phenomenon in which radios, televisions, and audio devices spontaneously activate at the moment of a person's death, or in the hours immediately preceding their final breath. Witnesses report finding devices that were powered down or unplugged, suddenly emanating sound, broadcasting music, static, or voices with no apparent mechanical explanation. In some cases, family members describe radios tuning themselves to specific stations that held significance to the deceased, or devices activating to play songs that carried deep personal meaning. These events often occur when no one is physically present in the room, eliminating the possibility of accidental contact or deliberate activation. Yet they happen with such consistency that medical professionals and grief counselors have developed informal frameworks for discussing them with bereaved families. The phenomenon spans cultural boundaries and generational divides, appearing in testimonies from urban hospitals and rural hospices alike, suggesting either a universal human experience or a deeply embedded cultural narrative that transcends geographic limitation. Psychological mechanism underlying this experience likely involves several converging factors. The heightened emotional state of witnesses creates a state of hypervigilance in which ordinary household sounds become extraordinarily salient. The human brain's pattern recognition systems activate involuntarily during crisis, and the ambient electromagnetic environment of medical settings may produce subtle fluctuations that coincide with moment of death purely by statistical probability. Additionally, the grief-stricken mind searches desperately for meaning and connection, essentially recruiting sensory data to construct narratives of continued presence and communication from the dying or recently departed. Throughout recorded medical history, there have been numerous documented instances where electronic devices and electrical systems have malfunctioned or behaved erratically in the presence of dying individuals, particularly in the moments immediately preceding or following death. Hospital staff members have reported that cardiac monitors would lose signal without any technical explanation, that lights would flicker or extinguish despite being on stable power supplies, that electrical equipment would activate spontaneously when no one had touched the switches or controls, and that devices would resume normal function shortly after the patient had expired. Some of these incidents have occurred across multiple pieces of equipment simultaneously, ruling out simple battery depletion or individual device failure, and several have been observed by multiple witnesses who could attest to the strangeness of what transpired. The phenomena have been recorded in intensive care units, nursing homes, and private residences where individuals were experiencing their final moments, and the events have persisted across different decades and different geographic locations, suggesting something more systematic than mere coincidence or misinterpretation. When we examine potential explanations, the most common hypothesis proposes that heightened electromagnetic activity within the human body during the dying process might somehow interact with nearby circuitry, perhaps through unknown bioelectric mechanisms or energy patterns that intensify as life systems begin to shut down. However, this theory remains largely speculative and has never been convincingly demonstrated in controlled laboratory settings, leaving us in the peculiar position of acknowledging a pattern that appears consistent enough to warrant attention, yet remaining unable to establish a definitive mechanism through which it operates. Among the most recurrent and documented observations reported by hospital staff, family members, and caregivers attending to the dying is the sudden and inexplicable falling of photographs from walls, shelves, and bedside tables at the precise moment of death or in the hours immediately preceding it. These incidents occur without apparent physical cause, no vibrations from footsteps, no drafts from open windows, no structural disturbances that would logically precipitate such an event. Instead, witnesses describe a peculiar sequence where a framed photograph, perhaps one that has remained undisturbed for months or years, abruptly falls to the floor or rotates outward on a shelf with enough force to sometimes crack the glass. The phenomenon appears most frequently when the photograph depicts the deceased individual themselves, a deceased loved one, or occasionally a figure bearing significant emotional weight in the dying person's life. Medical professionals offer conventional explanations, the settling of aged frames, minute vibrations in floorboards, or the subtle air pressure changes that accompany the final moments of respiration. Yet these explanations consistently falter when examined against the specificity of the timing and the selectivity of which photographs are affected. What makes this phenomenon particularly compelling is that it transcends cultural boundaries and appears with remarkable consistency across centuries of deathbed accounts, suggesting either an extraordinary coincidence or something that conventional physics has yet to adequately address. The rational mind gravitates toward the psychological explanation that our pattern-seeking brains impose meaning on random occurrence, that grief and heightened emotional attention make us hypersensitive to minor environmental shifts we would otherwise ignore. Yet this theory struggles against the sheer number of independent witnesses who report being startled by these falls. The documented cases in hospitals where security footage has been reviewed and staff have confirmed no reasonable mechanical cause. In hospitals and hospices across the world, medical staff and family members have reported a peculiar phenomenon occurring in the moments surrounding a patient's death. Doors that were closed suddenly swing open on their own, with no discernible cause, no draft, no mechanical failure, and no logical explanation rooted in the physical environment. These incidents are documented not in folklore or anecdotal whispers, but in the actual observations of trained nurses, physicians, and witnesses present at the moment of passing, who describe the experience with unsettling consistency and clarity. The doors do not creak slightly ajar as though responding to air pressure changes. Rather, they open decisively, sometimes dramatically, as if pushed by an intentional force, occurring most frequently in the seconds immediately before or after a patient's final breath, suggesting a temporal connection that defies conventional understanding. Some healthcare workers have theorized that these events might be explained by changes in air pressure within the room, shifts in temperature, or vibrations from medical equipment being turned off. Yet these explanations consistently fall short when scrutinized against the actual circumstances, as many documented cases involve sealed, climate-controlled environments where such variables remain stable, and the doors open in isolation without any corresponding environmental disturbance. The psychological mechanism at work here may involve a heightened state of suggestibility among grieving or emotionally charged observers, where the mind unconsciously seeks patterns and meaning in neutral events, transforming the ordinary occurrence of a door swinging shut from a prior opening into a metaphysically significant moment, thereby creating false memories or selective attention that filters out mundane causes. Throughout medical literature and deathbed accounts, there exist consistent reports of objects shifting position, falling, or moving across surfaces without any identifiable physical force at the moment of death or in the hours preceding it. Witnesses describe bedside items, glasses of water, flowers in vases, photographs, medical equipment, relocating themselves in ways that seem to defy the natural laws of physics and motion. In some documented cases, objects have been observed moving while all parties present were stationary and at considerable distance, with no drafts, vibrations, or mechanical explanations accounting for the displacement. These movements are often sudden and purposeful in their trajectory, as if guided by invisible intention rather than random physical processes. Family members and healthcare professionals have reported watching personal effects that held meaning for the dying person move toward them or arrange themselves in unusual configurations, creating an unsettling sense that something beyond conventional understanding was occurring in that sacred final space. The phenomenon transcends cultures, appearing in accounts from hospices, hospitals, and homes across continents and centuries. Some witnesses interpret these movements as spiritual communication or manifestation of consciousness departing the body, while others struggle to categorize the events within any rational framework. What remains remarkable is how consistently these accounts describe purposeful motion rather than chaotic displacement, suggesting either a profound perceptual shift in dying individuals and those attending them, or an actual physical process that contemporary science has not yet developed the instruments or methodology to measure and explain with precision. The persistence of these reports, despite scientific skepticism, indicates either a systematic flaw in human observation during moments of high emotion, or the existence of forces acting at the threshold between life and death that remain fundamentally incompatible with our current understanding of physical reality and the mechanisms governing material objects in space. Throughout history, across numerous cultures and continents, families attending to dying relatives have reported hearing the sudden, inexplicable ringing of bells in the moments surrounding death, despite no visible mechanism or person to produce such sounds, and these accounts persist with striking consistency across centuries of documented cases, from Victorian death records to modern hospice testimonies, often occurring moments before the final breath or immediately after. Sometimes described as a single clear tone, other times as sustained pealing that fills the room with an almost musical quality that witnesses describe as neither threatening nor entirely comforting, but profoundly disorienting in its apparent purposelessness. The explanation offered by skeptics and medical professionals centers on the phenomenon of auditory hallucination, the mind's remarkable ability to generate false sensory perceptions in states of extreme emotional distress, sleep deprivation, and heightened suggestibility that naturally accompany vigils at a loved one's bedside, where the combination of grief, exhaustion, and anticipatory anxiety can cause the brain to construct sounds that feel as real and external as any physical bell. And the power of expectation cannot be underestimated, as cultural narratives and family lore establish a framework where bell sounds become the anticipated herald of death, thus priming the listener's brain to interpret ambient noise, creaking floorboards, settling pipes, distant traffic, as the unmistakable ring of supernatural summons. In hospices and hospitals around the world, medical staff and family members attending to the dying have reported a peculiar and recurring phenomenon that defies easy explanation: the sudden, overwhelming scent of flowers appearing in rooms where no flowers are present. Patients in their final hours, sometimes unconscious or heavily sedated, have allegedly become aware of fragrant aromas, often describing them as beautiful and comforting, while those beside them catch only faint or non-existent traces of these same scents. The experiences are remarkably consistent across cultures and geographic regions, with reports dating back centuries in medical literature and spiritual traditions alike. Families describe entering a room filled with the unmistakable perfume of roses, lilies, or gardenias, only to find windowsills bare and no floral arrangements anywhere within sight. Some accounts suggest the scent appears moments before death occurs, as though announcing a transition rather than marking its aftermath. Medical explanations have attempted to attribute these phenomena to olfactory hallucinations triggered by neurochemical changes in the dying brain, or perhaps the release of endorphins creating altered sensory perception. Yet this framework struggles to account for why multiple independent witnesses in the same space sometimes report experiencing the same fragrance simultaneously, or why such olfactory experiences seem disproportionately pleasant compared to other deathbed hallucinations, which are frequently disturbing or chaotic. The phenomenon remains largely undocumented in clinical settings because it exists in the liminal space between subjective experience and measurable reality, difficult to quantify or replicate in laboratory conditions. Across countless deathbed accounts, medical personnel, family members, and witnesses report an inexplicable phenomenon in the moments surrounding a person's final breath. The temperature in the room appears to plummet dramatically, often described as a sudden, penetrating cold that seems to emanate from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, creating an atmosphere so distinct that multiple observers notice it at precisely the same moment, yet thermometers placed throughout the space register no corresponding drop in actual temperature, leaving medical professionals puzzled and family members unsettled by an experience that feels undeniably real despite defying rational measurement. The phenomenon has been documented across different cultures, religions, and geographic regions, with remarkably consistent descriptions suggesting that regardless of ambient conditions or season, individuals in the presence of the dying frequently experience this overwhelming sensation of cold just as consciousness fades from the body. Some hospice workers have reported removing blankets only to watch patients request them back moments later, while simultaneously the attending relatives shiver intensely despite the room actually being warm according to all available instruments, creating a bizarre disconnect between subjective human perception and objective scientific data that leaves observers questioning whether they experienced a genuine environmental shift or something far more elusive. The psychological explanation typically centers on heightened emotional states and the body's natural stress response, which can cause peripheral vasoconstriction that makes individuals feel cold even in neutral environments, combined with the profound anxiety and anticipatory grief that accompanies witnessing death. Sensations that could theoretically produce such an overwhelming physical impression that the brain interprets it as an external environmental change rather than an internal physiological response. In the final moments before death, numerous accounts from hospice workers, family members, and medical professionals describe a peculiar phenomenon in which the dying person's body, often cold and pallid from declining circulation, suddenly becomes noticeably warm to the touch, sometimes described as intensely hot, creating an almost inexplicable thermal shift that occurs within minutes or even seconds of the last breath. Family members have reported placing their hands on the foreheads or chests of their dying loved ones, expecting the clammy coolness that typically characterizes the approach of death, only to encounter surprising warmth that seems to radiate outward from the core of the body, a sensation so pronounced that some observers have mistaken it for a sign of recovery or miraculous intervention, only to have that hope extinguished moments later when all vital signs cease entirely. Medical science offers several conventional explanations for this occurrence, suggesting that the final muscular contractions of a dying body or the release of stored metabolic energy as cellular processes shut down in sequence could generate temporary heat, or that shifting blood flow patterns in the moments before death might create a sensation of warmth in the skin. Though these explanations remain largely theoretical and fail to account for the consistency and intensity with which this phenomenon is reported across diverse cases and circumstances. What remains difficult to reconcile is that the timing of this warmth appears uncorrelated with the severity of illness, the patient's body temperature prior to the event, or environmental factors that would ordinarily influence thermal perception, suggesting that something more complex than simple physiological mechanics might be at work. Despite our advanced understanding of human biology and thermodynamics, this deathbed warmth persists as a documented occurrence that mainstream medicine acknowledges without fully understanding, described in medical literature with clinical detachment, while remaining largely unexplained in its mechanisms and causes. One of the most frequently reported phenomena in deathbed observations involves the unmistakable sensation that another being has entered the room, despite no person actually arriving through the door, a presence so tangible and commanding that family members and medical staff often turn their heads in unison, searching for the source of what feels like an undeniable arrival, yet find only empty space where they sensed movement or pressure or weight shifting the very air itself. Patients in their final moments often report seeing or feeling a figure standing near them, a comforting entity that remains just beyond clear vision, sometimes described as a deceased loved one and sometimes as an undefined but decidedly present force. And these reports come with such certainty and calm that observers are left deeply unsettled, as if they have glimpsed evidence of something crossing from one realm into another. The medical and psychological communities have proposed several mechanisms to explain this phenomenon, pointing to the dying brain's release of endorphins and the cascade of neurochemical changes that occur as consciousness begins to dissolve, suggesting that the temporal and parietal lobes of the brain may misfire in ways that create a profound sense of presence where none exists, a misfiring that projects consciousness outward into the room itself, creating the unmistakable impression of an external entity. Researchers have also noted that oxygen deprivation and the buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood during the dying process can produce hallucinations with remarkable clarity and emotional resonance, and that the human brain is fundamentally wired to detect presences and faces even in ambiguous stimuli, a survival mechanism that may activate intensely as the body approaches death. Throughout history and across virtually every culture, there are documented accounts of animals exhibiting extraordinary behavioral changes in the presence of dying individuals, as though they possess some form of extrasensory perception that humans lack entirely. Cats are reported to suddenly abandon their usual patterns and sit silently beside terminally ill patients, while dogs have been known to refuse to enter rooms where death is imminent, scratching at doors and whimpering with apparent distress. More remarkably, nursing homes have documented cases of facility cats that seem to predict deaths with uncanny accuracy, spending their final hours with specific patients who die within hours of the animal's vigil, suggesting some capability to detect imperceptible changes in the human body's biochemistry or electromagnetic signature. These behaviors occur too frequently and too consistently across independent observations to be attributed to pure coincidence, yet they remain utterly unexplained by conventional veterinary or neurological science. When we examine potential explanations, we find ourselves reaching for logical mechanisms like the detection of chemical changes during organ failure or subtle acoustic shifts in breathing patterns, yet these rational hypotheses fail to account for the precision and apparent intentionality of animal behavior, particularly in cases where dying patients are isolated and unconscious. The animals seem to know not just that death is approaching, but precisely when and where, displaying purposefulness that suggests knowledge beyond sensory detection. Despite decades of scientific study into animal cognition and sensory perception, researchers have published remarkably little definitive evidence about how or why this phenomenon occurs, leaving the mechanism firmly in the realm of mystery. In hospice facilities and nursing homes across the world, staff members and families have documented a recurring phenomenon involving cats that seems to defy conventional explanation. Certain felines appear to possess an uncanny ability to predict the imminent death of patients, often spending hours in the rooms of individuals who will pass within hours or days, despite having shown no previous attachment to those individuals. One of the most well-known cases emerged from Steerhouse Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Rhode Island, where a cat named Oscar became famous for sitting vigil with dying patients, and nurses reported that his presence in a patient's room was nearly always followed by that patient's death within a short time frame, sometimes hours, leading the facility to eventually call family members to gather when Oscar took up residence with a particular resident. The phenomenon has been observed repeatedly by healthcare workers who swear that these cats exhibit behavior patterns that appear to transcend normal animal cognition, entering rooms where the patient is still conscious and alert, remaining perfectly still and calm, and providing what observers describe as comfort despite the animal's apparent foreknowledge of the outcome. The mechanism behind this behavior likely involves the cat's extraordinary sensitivity to chemical and physiological changes that occur as the human body approaches death, including variations in body temperature, shifts in skin chemistry, alterations in respiratory patterns, and the release of specific volatile organic compounds that humans cannot consciously perceive but that cats, possessing approximately 14 times more olfactory receptors than people, can detect with remarkable precision. Additionally, cats may be responding to behavioral changes in patients such as reduced movement, altered vocalization, or shifts in energy that signal to the animal's instinctive understanding that this particular human is transitioning into a vulnerable state. Throughout human history and across countless cultures, families have reported a peculiar and unsettling phenomenon occurring in the hours or days immediately preceding the death of a household member. Their dog begins to howl persistently, mournfully, and often inconsolably, despite showing no signs of distress or physical illness. These are not the casual barks or playful yips of a normal day, but deep, sustained vocalizations that seem to emanate from profound emotional distress, as though the animal has somehow become aware of an impending loss that has yet to occur in the visible, measurable world around it. Family members describe their pets becoming withdrawn, refusing food, and fixating intensely on the dying person's location, staring at them with an unusual intensity that transcends ordinary animal behavior. The dog may follow the person from room to room with singular focus or sit beside their bed for hours without moving, and then begin these haunting howls that seem to express a form of grief that shouldn't logically exist until after the actual death has taken place. Veterinarians and animal behaviorists have proposed several rational explanations for this phenomenon, suggesting that dogs possess an extraordinary sensitivity to subtle biochemical changes in the human body as it approaches death, including alterations in scent markers, hormonal shifts, and the release of certain compounds that precede the final moments of life. According to this perspective, animals are simply reacting to genuine sensory information that human beings, with our comparatively limited olfactory capabilities, remain entirely unable to detect or consciously interpret. This explanation provides a comforting logical framework that preserves our understanding of animal cognition while acknowledging genuine animal sensitivity rather than invoking anything mysterious or unexplainable. In hospices and private homes across the world, a recurring phenomenon has been documented by nurses, family members, and medical professionals who tend to the dying, and it involves the sudden and persistent appearance of birds gathering at windows during the final hours or days of a patient's life. These birds, which may be common species like sparrows, crows, or doves, exhibit behavior that seems unusual and purposeful, often remaining at the glass for extended periods, tapping or fluttering against the pane as though attempting to communicate or gain entry to the room where death is imminent. The accounts are remarkably consistent across different cultures, different continents, and different time periods, with witnesses reporting that these avian visitors appear with an almost uncanny timing, arriving shortly before a patient's condition deteriorates significantly or precisely when the end is near. What makes these observations particularly intriguing is that the birds do not appear to be seeking food or shelter in any conventional sense, as they often ignore food sources and remain focused on the window itself, occasionally making eye contact with observers inside the room. Medical science offers several rational explanations for this phenomenon, suggesting that birds may be responding to subtle changes in electromagnetic fields that occur during significant biological transitions, or that they might be attracted to shifts in temperature regulation as the body begins its final shutdown. The psychological dimension cannot be entirely dismissed either, as the human mind, particularly when stressed and grieving, tends to find patterns and significance in natural events, potentially misinterpreting coincidental animal behavior as something more profound or meaningful. In the hours and days following a person's death, families and caregivers have reported an unusual and recurring phenomenon: the sudden appearance of butterflies in rooms where the deceased spent their final moments, or gathering near windows and doorways of homes where death has just occurred. These accounts come from nurses, hospice workers, family members, and medical professionals who describe moments when a butterfly, sometimes a single specimen, sometimes several, arrives inexplicably indoors during winter months when such creatures should be dormant, or appears with such precise timing relative to the moment of passing that the coincidence strains credibility. The butterfly often displays behavior described as unusual or almost purposeful, hovering near the face of the deceased, returning repeatedly to the same location, or remaining present for hours in an environment where it logically should not survive. These reports span cultures, religions, and geographic regions, suggesting something beyond isolated anecdotal experience, yet the phenomenon resists scientific documentation and refuses to submit to controlled observation or rational explanation. The psychological mechanism underlying this experience appears rooted in the human need to perceive meaning in moments of profound loss and transition, a phenomenon known as apophenia, our tendency to find significance in random events when emotional stakes are highest. Butterflies carry rich symbolic weight across human civilization, representing transformation, the soul's journey, resurrection, and the bridge between the material and immaterial worlds, making them psychologically potent vessels for grief processing and the search for signs of continuity after death. Witnesses experiencing acute grief are in heightened states of perceptual sensitivity, where attention narrows intensely, memory becomes fluid, and the boundary between observed reality and interpreted meaning becomes remarkably porous. Among the most recurring and enigmatic deathbed phenomena documented across cultures and centuries is the sudden appearance of feathers in spaces where no feathers should logically exist, materializing at the moment of death or in the hours immediately following it, often discovered resting upon the chest of the deceased, positioned delicately on a pillow, or found inexplicably placed within sealed rooms where windows remain closed and doors have not been opened since the person's final breath. Hospice workers, family members, and nurses have reported finding these feathers with such frequency and consistency that entire networks of bereaved individuals have emerged online, sharing photographs and detailed accounts of pristine white or iridescent feathers that appear in hospital rooms, private homes, and care facilities, each story describing the feather as impossibly clean and perfectly formed, bearing no signs of decomposition or environmental wear despite their mysterious origins. The feathers typically manifest without any logical source, as there are no birds nesting within the structure, no open windows through which feathers could drift, no pillows or blankets that have been disturbed or opened to release their filling, leaving investigators and family members searching their immediate environment with growing bewilderment, finding no explanation for how these objects came to rest where they are discovered. Psychologically, researchers have theorized that the human mind during periods of intense grief and heightened emotional vulnerability becomes extraordinarily susceptible to pattern recognition and symbolic interpretation, perceiving ordinary objects as signs and messages from deceased loved ones, with feathers holding deep archetypal significance across spiritual and religious traditions as symbols of transcendence, divine presence, and the liberation of the soul from its earthly vessel. Throughout recorded history and across virtually every culture, there exists a persistent and haunting observation that deaths rarely occur in isolation, but rather seem to arrive in clusters of three, a phenomenon so widespread that it has become embedded in folklore, superstition, and even casual conversation among families who have experienced multiple losses within short timeframes. When a prominent public figure passes away, people begin watching the news with an almost morbid anticipation, waiting to see which two other notable individuals will follow, as if death itself operates according to some invisible ledger that demands balance through the completion of a trinity. This pattern has been reported countless times by grieving families, medical professionals, and funeral home directors who claim to observe an uncanny regularity in how mortality clusters around this particular number, creating a sense that some force beyond our understanding orchestrates these timing coincidences into meaningful groupings rather than random occurrences. The mechanism behind this phenomenon likely stems from a combination of cognitive biases and pattern recognition instincts deeply rooted in human psychology, as our brains are extraordinarily efficient at detecting patterns even where none objectively exist, leading us to remember and emphasize instances where three deaths did occur in sequence, while unconsciously discarding the countless occasions when deaths happened singly or in groups of two or four. Additionally, once we become aware that one death has occurred, our heightened emotional state and increased attention to news and social circles make us far more likely to notice subsequent deaths that we might otherwise have overlooked, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where anticipation actively shapes perception. There exists a peculiar temporal phenomenon in mortality data that has confounded researchers for decades: the tendency of individuals to die not randomly throughout the year, but rather on or near significant dates already marked by loss in their personal or family history. A widow, having lost her husband 5 years prior, experiences a sudden cardiac event on their wedding anniversary. A man passes away on the exact date his father died, despite having no prior knowledge of his father's death occurring on that particular day. A woman, who has survived cancer for years, succumbs to complications on the birthday of a child she lost decades earlier. These are not isolated incidents whispered in funeral homes, but rather documented patterns that appear consistently enough in mortality statistics to warrant serious consideration, yet remain stubbornly resistant to straightforward medical or biological explanation. Medical examiners and cardiologists have noted with genuine puzzlement that in cases where multiple family members die on the same calendar date across different years, autopsies reveal nothing extraordinary. The deaths follow expected pathological patterns, yet the clustering persists. Psychologists propose the mechanism involves profound psychological stress activating latent health vulnerabilities, where the emotional weight of an anniversary triggers sympathetic nervous system activation, elevating cortisol levels and increasing susceptibility to cardiac events or stroke in those already compromised. The phenomenon suggests that our bodies possess an almost calendar-aware capacity to respond to temporal significance, though how the mind communicates such specificity to the physical body remains medically unclear. What makes this phenomenon endure in scientific literature is not denial of its existence, but rather the uncomfortable recognition that we have normalized psychological influence over mortality itself, yet possess no unified framework explaining the mechanism by which anticipatory grief or unconscious date recognition can reliably precipitate death on schedule. Throughout medical history, physicians and hospice workers have documented a peculiar phenomenon in which terminally ill patients, particularly the elderly, seem to possess an almost supernatural ability to delay their death until a significant date arrives, most commonly a birthday, anniversary, or holiday of personal importance. The pattern is remarkably consistent. A patient in the final stages of illness, perhaps unconscious or semi-conscious, with vital signs indicating imminent death, will inexplicably stabilize or hold on for days or even weeks until the anticipated date passes, after which they decline rapidly and die within hours or days. Family members frequently report that their dying loved one expressed, either verbally or through subtle gestures, a determination to reach that particular milestone, and somehow, against all medical expectation, they do. The phenomenon has been observed across cultures, socioeconomic groups, and medical settings, suggesting it transcends simple coincidence or confirmation bias. One explanation centers on the mind-body connection and the power of intention, proposing that a sufficiently strong psychological purpose can influence physiological processes at a fundamental level, keeping the body functioning through sheer will or subconscious determination. Another framework suggests that the dying brain, faced with mortality, seizes upon meaningful temporal markers as organizing principles, and that survival instinct, even when death is certain, redirects itself toward these achievable interim goals rather than accepting finality. Yet despite decades of research into psychoneuroimmunology and the documented effects of psychological state on physical health, no mechanism adequately explains how a failing heart, deteriorating organs, or advancing cancer could respond to an abstract future date. The phenomenon persists in medical literature as one of those stubborn observations that defies reduction to simple biology, remaining as one of the final mysteries of human consciousness at the threshold between life and death. Throughout hospitals and hospice facilities worldwide, medical professionals have observed a peculiar pattern that defies easy explanation. Terminally ill patients frequently seem to postpone death until after significant holidays or family gatherings, as though their bodies possess some internal mechanism that allows the dying to choose the timing of their final moments. This phenomenon, documented repeatedly in medical literature and nursing journals, presents cases where patients in the final stages of illness have inexplicably lingered through Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthdays, or anniversaries, only to pass away days or weeks after the significant date has passed. Families have reported witnessing elderly relatives who appeared to be actively dying suddenly stabilize when grandchildren arrived for holiday visits, maintaining consciousness and engagement during celebrations before declining rapidly once the guests departed. The mechanism behind this mysterious postponement remains largely unclear to modern medicine, though researchers have proposed several interconnected theories involving psychological determination, the role of social connection and purpose, and potentially unknown neurochemical processes that may suppress the body's natural shutdown sequence when emotionally significant events loom near. Some suggest that the human will to survive, when presented with a compelling reason to remain present, can paradoxically override failing biology, creating a temporary reprieve from the inevitable decline that defines terminal illness. Others propose that the presence of loved ones and the anticipation of shared meaningful moments trigger subtle physiological changes that provide unexpected energy and stability to dying systems. Yet despite decades of observation and the accumulation of anecdotal evidence from countless medical professionals, science has not produced a definitive explanation for how consciousness and will might exert such tangible influence over mortality itself, leaving this phenomenon in the curious space between documented reality and complete mystery. Throughout human history and across nearly every culture studied by medical researchers, a peculiar and haunting phenomenon occurs when one spouse dies. The surviving partner frequently follows within months or even weeks, often from no identifiable medical cause. This phenomenon, known as the Widowhood Effect, represents one of the most documented yet scientifically perplexing aspects of human mortality that challenges our understanding of how grief and loss interact with the body's fundamental systems. The effect is not merely anecdotal. Extensive longitudinal studies have confirmed that widows and widowers experience dramatically elevated mortality rates in the months immediately following their spouse's death, with some research indicating an increase in mortality risk of up to 30% or more during the first 3 months of bereavement. The causes of death vary widely among those affected. Heart attacks, strokes, infections, and even accidents occur at elevated rates. Yet the common thread remains the recent loss of a long-term partner, suggesting that something profound and systemic occurs within the grieving spouse's physiology. Researchers have proposed numerous mechanisms to explain this effect, pointing to the disruption of daily routines, the loss of social connection and emotional support, increased stress hormone production, weakened immune function, poor nutrition, and the psychological trauma of existential loss. The sympathetic nervous system appears to become hyperactivated during acute grief, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline, which over prolonged periods can damage cardiovascular tissue and increase vulnerability to sudden cardiac events. Yet despite these proposed mechanisms, the exact process by which profound emotional pain translates so directly into physical death remains incompletely understood, and many cases of widowhood-related mortality cannot be fully accounted for by these explanations alone. The phenomenon persists as a reminder that the mind and body remain mysteriously intertwined in ways modern medicine has yet to completely decode. In the aftermath of profound emotional trauma, particularly following the sudden loss of a beloved spouse or child, medical professionals have documented cases where seemingly healthy individuals experience acute cardiac events that mimic heart attacks in every measurable way. Yet the underlying coronary arteries remain entirely clear and unobstructed. This phenomenon, formerly known as Takotsubo cardiomyopathy or stress cardiomyopathy, presents one of the most striking examples of how psychological devastation can manifest as genuine physiological crisis, blurring the ancient boundary between matters of emotion and matters of flesh. The condition typically strikes within hours or days of receiving news of death or catastrophic loss, and victims describe a sensation of crushing chest pain, breathlessness, and overwhelming pressure identical to a myocardial infarction. Yet when cardiologists examine the coronary arteries through catheterization, they find no blockages, no clots, no structural damage whatsoever. What they do observe is a distinctive bulging of the left ventricle's apex, creating a shape resembling a Japanese octopus trap, from which the syndrome derives its name. The mechanism appears rooted in an acute surge of stress hormones, particularly catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine, which flood the system during extreme emotional distress and can temporarily stun the heart muscle into dysfunction, causing it to contract weakly and irregularly. The body, quite literally, responds to loss as if to a physical threat, mobilizing ancient survival pathways designed for immediate danger rather than existential grief. Most patients recover within weeks or months as the stress hormones normalize and the heart muscle regains its contractile strength. Yet the episode leaves them fundamentally changed, aware that sorrow itself possesses the power to stop the heart just as effectively as any arterial blockade, and in some cases, these patients do not recover at all. Among the sensory faculties that persist during the final moments of human life, hearing stands as perhaps the most resilient and the most mysterious in its durability. Medical professionals and hospice workers have documented countless instances where patients who have entered deeply unconscious states, who no longer respond to touch or visual stimuli, who have ceased all voluntary movement and communication, nonetheless appear to react to auditory input in ways that suggest some form of awareness persists within the fading architecture of consciousness. Family members speaking softly at a bedside have reported subtle changes in breathing patterns, slight alterations in facial expression, or gentle movements of the eyes beneath closed lids, occurring precisely at moments when words of comfort or familiar voices reach the ear. This phenomenon has been observed across cultures and throughout recorded medical history with such consistency that it forms an almost universal component of end-of-life guidance, wherein healthcare providers instruct loved ones to continue speaking, singing, or playing music even when all other signs of responsiveness have vanished completely. The neurological mechanism underlying this persistence remains inadequately understood by contemporary science, though researchers propose that the auditory pathway from the cochlea through the brainstem may function independently of the higher cortical structures that regulate consciousness and voluntary response. Yet this explanation itself raises profound questions, for if hearing truly operates through such primitive neural circuits, why should the brain privilege the processing of incoming sound when so much of its computational capacity has already surrendered to the dying process? The phenomenon endures not because we have solved its mystery, but rather because we have woven it so deeply into the fabric of end-of-life ritual and belief that few question whether our assumptions about what the dying can perceive have any foundation in verifiable fact. Throughout hospitals and care facilities worldwide, families and medical staff have documented countless instances in which patients who are clinically comatose, unresponsive, and seemingly absent from consciousness appear to react to external stimuli in ways that suggest some level of awareness persists beneath the surface of their apparent unconsciousness. These responses manifest in various forms: a squeeze of the hand when a loved one speaks their name, a tear rolling down the cheek during an emotional conversation, a sudden movement or change in breathing pattern when music plays that held personal significance, or even what appears to be purposeful eye movement beneath closed eyelids. These phenomena occur in patients with severe brain injuries, those in persistent vegetative states, individuals diagnosed as minimally conscious, and people who should theoretically possess no capacity for interaction or comprehension of their environment. Neurologically speaking, the mechanisms that would permit such responses remain profoundly unclear, as brain imaging often shows extensive damage to regions associated with consciousness, communication, and sensory processing. Yet families report consistent patterns of reaction when specific individuals visit, particular songs are played, or familiar voices speak certain phrases, suggesting some form of retained recognition or emotional responsiveness that current neuroscience cannot adequately explain or predict. The persistence of these observations, despite decades of research, and our increasingly sophisticated understanding of brain function, raises questions about the nature of consciousness itself, and whether our clinical definitions of states like coma and vegetative state capture the full complexity of human awareness. What remains peculiar is how readily these accounts are documented, and yet how rarely they reshape the fundamental frameworks through which medical professionals assess consciousness and prognosis, as though we have collectively decided to accept these phenomena as real while maintaining our existing theoretical models unchanged. In hospices and hospitals around the world, medical staff and family members have documented a peculiar phenomenon among the dying. Patients who have spent decades speaking a secondary language fluently, often their adopted country's tongue, suddenly begin reverting to the language of their childhood in their final hours or days. A man who immigrated from Poland at age 20 and spoke English without accent for 60 years suddenly begins murmuring in Polish as his organs fail. A woman who fled her native Tamil Nadu region and raised her family speaking Hindi and English finds herself speaking only Tamil in her delirium. Nurses report that these patients often cannot be reached through their adopted languages anymore, even when family members attempt to communicate in the lingua they have used for most of their adult lives. Instead, the dying seem to retreat into the linguistic landscape of their earliest memories, the sounds their mothers made, the words they learned before consciousness fully formed. This regression appears unrelated to dementia or neurological decline, as it can occur in patients with sharp minds and stable cognitive function in their final conscious moments. The phenomenon suggests that our mother tongue occupies a different neural architecture than languages acquired later, stored perhaps in more primitive or protected regions of the brain that remain accessible even as higher functions begin to dissolve. Yet neuroscience has not fully mapped why this particular layer of language should survive the general degradation of consciousness itself. Some theorize that the mother tongue is encoded not merely as language, but as pure sensation and survival instinct, bonded to the earliest neural pathways that developed before full linguistic sophistication emerged. Others suggest that facing mortality triggers an unconscious return to the safest, most comforting state of being, which for most humans is the linguistic environment of maternal care and absolute dependency. In the final hours before death, some individuals report accessing information they could not possibly have obtained through conventional means, a phenomenon that has been documented across centuries and cultures with striking consistency. A dying woman suddenly speaks fluently in a language she never learned, reciting complex medical terminology with perfect accuracy despite having only a third-grade education. A man in his final moments describes in meticulous detail the layout of a city he has never visited, naming streets and landmarks that prove entirely accurate upon later verification. These instances of sudden knowledge appear without warning, often lasting only minutes, and then fade as the person's consciousness deteriorates further into the dying process. Families and medical professionals alike struggle to rationalize these occurrences, searching for explanations rooted in memory recall, hallucination, or neurological misfiring, yet the specificity and accuracy of the information conveyed often contradicts these conventional frameworks entirely. The phenomenon touches upon fundamental questions about consciousness and whether the dying mind might access information through channels that neuroscience has not yet identified or acknowledged. Some theorists propose that extreme physiological stress triggers suppressed memories or latent knowledge, while others suggest that certain individuals might possess forms of perception that remain dormant until the threshold between life and death is approached. Yet despite decades of research in thanatology and near-death studies, no comprehensive model has emerged that adequately explains how a person with no training could suddenly demonstrate expertise, articulate forgotten languages, or access factual information about distant places. The persistence of these accounts, combined with their resistance to easy dismissal, continues to occupy an uncertain space in medical literature, neither fully embraced nor definitively refuted by mainstream science. Throughout medical history and across cultures, there exists a documented pattern in which terminally ill patients, often in their final hours or moments, speak words that later prove startlingly accurate about events they could not possibly have known or predicted, or they deliver messages of profound significance that seem to transcend ordinary cognition. A dying grandmother might whisper her estranged grandson's name moments before learning he has been in an accident, or a patient in the final stages of consciousness utters specific details about future family decisions that unfold exactly as described weeks after their death. These instances have been reported by physicians, nurses, hospice workers, and grieving families across decades and continents, documented with enough consistency to warrant serious consideration rather than dismissal. The phenomenon appears independent of the patient's prior state of awareness, their medication regimen, or their ability to have gathered information through conventional means. What becomes particularly intriguing is that these utterances often carry a tone of certainty and calm that distinguishes them from ordinary delirium or the rambling confusion typically associated with terminal sedation or organ failure. The prevailing psychological explanation suggests that the dying brain, in its heightened state of neurochemical flux, may experience a form of pattern recognition so acute that it simulates precognition, or that families unconsciously remember prophetic statements selectively while forgetting countless mundane final words, creating a cognitive bias toward the significant. Yet this explanation struggles to account for instances in which the prophecy concerns events entirely outside the patient's sphere of influence, or when multiple independent witnesses document identical exact wording. Throughout medical and historical records, there exists a peculiar phenomenon wherein individuals approaching the end of their lives have made detailed confessions about crimes, secrets, or knowledge they had concealed for decades, often with corroborating evidence that later confirms their accuracy despite having no apparent way to verify the details beforehand. These confessions have been documented in hospital settings, hospice care facilities, and private residences, sometimes witnessed by medical professionals, family members, and clergy who attest to the specificity and emotional weight of the revelations. In several well-documented cases, dying individuals have confessed to crimes they were never suspected of committing, leading authorities to investigations that uncovered physical evidence, victims' remains, or accomplices that matched the deathbed account with striking precision. The psychological explanation typically offered by medical professionals attributes this phenomenon to the removal of social inhibition as cognitive filters decline, suggesting that fear of legal consequence or social judgment loses its grip when mortality becomes imminent and certain. Yet this explanation encounters difficulties when confronted with cases where the confessor possessed obscure knowledge they could not reasonably have obtained through ordinary means, or when confessions reveal details about locations or events unknown to the wider public, details that proved accurate upon investigation. The phenomenon persists in our collective consciousness, despite the presumption that we have adequately explained it through the lens of neurological decline and psychological release, normalized within frameworks of deathbed authenticity and final redemption that have become embedded in both medical practice and cultural expectation. As individuals approach the final days and hours of life, medical professionals and family members have documented a peculiar phenomenon wherein dying patients report a marked increase in the frequency and clarity of their visual experiences, often describing visions that feel more vivid and persistent than any waking perception they have known, manifesting as encounters with deceased relatives, ethereal landscapes, or beings of light that seem to intensify rather than diminish as consciousness begins to fade. These visions typically emerge during periods when the patient's physical condition is deteriorating most rapidly, when medication levels are highest, and when the brain's oxygen supply is becoming increasingly compromised. Yet paradoxically, patients report that these experiences feel more real and more detailed than ordinary memory or imagination could possibly generate, with some describing colors that do not exist in normal human perception and spatial dimensions that seem to extend beyond the physical room. The psychological explanation centers on the brain's response to hypoxia and the release of endogenous compounds such as dimethyltryptamine during extreme stress, which can produce intensely vivid hallucinations that the conscious mind interprets through the lens of personal belief systems and cultural conditioning, creating experiences that feel laden with meaning and purpose rather than random neurological misfiring. Additionally, as cognitive filters begin to dissolve under the influence of organ failure and medication, the brain may lose its ability to distinguish between memory, imagination, and external perception, allowing suppressed neural activity to surge forward as though it were genuine sensory input, creating an overwhelming flood of internal experience that feels more tangible than anything external. In the final hours and days before death, patients frequently report experiencing vivid, intensely meaningful dreams that differ markedly from ordinary sleep phenomena. Dreams that often seem to possess a clarity and emotional weight that defies the confusion typically associated with terminal illness and end-stage medication regimens. Family members and caregivers consistently describe witnessing patients who have been largely unresponsive suddenly becoming animated during sleep, speaking to figures invisible to those around them, gesturing toward doorways or windows, sometimes calling out names of deceased loved ones or describing landscapes of remarkable beauty and peace. These end-of-life dreams occur across cultures, religions, and belief systems, suggesting a biological or neurological foundation rather than purely cultural conditioning. Yet the precise mechanism remains inexplicable within our current understanding of neuroscience and consciousness. The dreams frequently contain common elements including journeys, reunions with people long dead, feelings of acceptance or resolution, and a sense of transitioning from one state of being to another, creating an almost narrative arc that seems to prepare the dying person for their imminent passage. Neuroscientists have proposed that these phenomena might result from changes in brain chemistry during the dying process, alterations in oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, or the release of endogenous compounds that create hallucinogenic experiences. Yet none of these theories fully account for the remarkable consistency, coherence, and emotional meaning that these dreams appear to hold for the dying. What remains profoundly unexplained is why these dreams should be so consistently beautiful, peaceful, and organized rather than chaotic or distressing, why they so frequently involve reunion and recognition rather than abandonment, and why they seem to serve a psychological function of easing the transition toward death itself. Among the most peculiar phenomena documented in hospice settings and deathbed accounts is what caregivers and family members have termed reunion language, a mysterious linguistic shift that occurs when dying individuals begin speaking to or about people who have already passed away, often using vocabulary, phrases, or even entire languages they had not actively used in decades, or in some cases, never consciously learned at all. Nurses and medical professionals working in end-of-life care have reported countless instances where patients in their final hours suddenly address deceased relatives by name, engage in conversations that appear one-sided to observers, and demonstrate an uncanny familiarity with private family matters or personal details that had been forgotten or never shared with them, all while employing speech patterns and expressions characteristic of people long dead. In some remarkable cases, individuals have begun speaking in childhood languages abandoned in infancy, or in regional dialects of their parents' homelands that they never formally studied, speaking with native-like fluency and emotional resonance that baffles linguistic experts when such accounts are examined. The psychological framework most commonly applied to this phenomenon suggests that as the brain enters its final stages and the boundaries between memory and present consciousness begin to dissolve, dying individuals may experience a kind of temporal collapse where the distinction between living and deceased loved ones becomes irrelevant, and their neurological systems activate deeply encoded linguistic and emotional memories that remain inaccessible during ordinary waking consciousness. Yet this explanation, while seemingly reasonable, fails to account for the specific accuracy and contextual appropriateness of these linguistic performances. The way dying patients sometimes correct family members using phrases only the deceased would have known, or the reports from multiple independent witnesses across different cultures and time periods describing nearly identical phenomena. Among the most perplexing phenomena documented in hospitals, hospices, and private residences across the world are instances in which multiple people simultaneously witness the same deathbed vision or apparition, suggesting that what the dying person experiences may not be entirely a product of individual neurological dysfunction, but rather something that possesses a quality of external reality that can be perceived by others present in the room. These events have been reported for centuries across cultures, with family members, nurses, and clergy describing moments when they observed alongside a dying patient the presence of deceased loved ones, luminous figures, or ethereal beings that seem to materialize at the moment of death, defying any reasonable explanation rooted in hallucination or psychological delusion. The cases that prove most difficult to dismiss are those in which observers who had no prior conversation with the dying person independently report seeing identical figures or experiencing the same inexplicable sensations simultaneously, a phenomenon that challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of perception and consciousness. Skeptics typically attribute these shared experiences to emotional contagion, where grief and anticipation create a psychological susceptibility to suggestion, or to the power of narrative reconstruction, wherein observers unconsciously conform their memories to match what they believe should have occurred during such a profound moment. Yet this conventional framework struggles to account for instances in which educated medical professionals, inherently skeptical of supernatural claims, have reported witnessing such phenomena and felt compelled to document their observations despite potential professional consequences. Across hospitals and hospice facilities worldwide, nurses report a peculiar phenomenon that occurs with remarkable consistency, yet remains largely undocumented in formal medical literature. When multiple nurses care for the same dying patient over successive shifts, they frequently report witnessing identical or nearly identical events at the moment of death, despite having no opportunity to communicate with one another beforehand. A nurse working the evening shift might observe the patient's eyes moving toward a specific corner of the room, or hear what sounds like a whispered conversation, or notice the room temperature dropping sharply. Hours later, when the night shift nurse discovers the patient has passed, and only then learns what the previous caregiver witnessed, the descriptions align with striking precision. Some nurses report seeing the same unexplained lights, hearing identical sounds, or observing the patient reaching toward the same location in space. These accounts come from trained medical professionals with decades of experience, individuals not prone to flights of fancy, yet they persistently describe these shared perceptions as though something objectively occurred that transcended individual subjective experience. The psychological explanation typically invoked suggests that nurses, operating under high stress and emotional investment in their patients, unconsciously create consistent narratives that conform to cultural expectations about death and the presence of unseen entities. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the specificity of these reports, the independent corroboration across different healthcare settings, and the matter-of-fact manner in which seasoned professionals describe events that contradict materialist frameworks. The phenomenon persists in our hospitals not because it has been adequately explained, but because the medical establishment has simply agreed to treat such reports as anecdotal observations unworthy of systematic investigation, leaving one of deathbed nursing's most consistent experiences suspended in a space between validated experience and clinical dismissal. One of the most perplexing phenomena observed in hospice and palliative care settings involves terminally ill patients who experience vivid, coherent visions and deathbed encounters despite being heavily sedated with powerful medications that should theoretically suppress all higher brain functions and consciousness itself. These patients, some administered doses of morphine, benzodiazepines, and other central nervous system depressants that would ordinarily render them unconscious or unable to form complex thoughts, nevertheless report detailed encounters with deceased relatives, religious figures, or otherworldly presences with remarkable consistency and clarity. The visions often occur when patients are at their most medicated, when brain activity should be at its lowest, when the neurological substrate for such experiences should be chemically suppressed beyond the possibility of generating organized perceptual content. Families and caregivers witness alert, lucid communication about these visions even as the medication drip continues its steady work through the patient's veins, creating a paradox that challenges conventional understanding of how consciousness, medication, and perception intersect at life's end. Medical professionals have attempted to explain this phenomenon through various frameworks, suggesting that perhaps the visions represent fragmentary hallucinations induced by the very medications being administered, or that they emerge from a dying brain's desperate attempt to create meaning as neural systems fail. Yet this explanation struggles against the testimonies of patients who demonstrate remarkable mental clarity during these experiences, whose descriptions contain specific details they could not have known through normal means, and whose accounts frequently coincide with the deaths of distant relatives occurring at the precise moment of their vision. Among the most perplexing deathbed phenomena documented by hospice workers, family members, and medical professionals is the occurrence of clear, vivid, and often remarkably coherent visions experienced by the dying who show no signs of delirium, fever, hypoxia, or any of the conventional neurological disturbances that would ordinarily produce hallucinations. These are not the confused, fragmented imaginings of a mind deteriorating into delirium. Rather, they are detailed, emotionally resonant experiences in which patients describe seeing deceased relatives, luminous figures, or landscapes of striking clarity and beauty, all while maintaining perfect awareness of their surroundings, their identities, and the reality of their approaching death. Patients report these visions with remarkable consistency and often express puzzlement at their own experiences, suggesting an authenticity to the phenomenon that resists easy dismissal. The mechanism remains deeply mysterious because all conventional explanations appear insufficient. The dying individuals possess normal oxygen saturation levels, clear sensorium, appropriate cognitive function, and no metabolic derangements that would justify such experiences. Yet the visions persist, occurring with such frequency and similarity across different cultures, time periods, and medical contexts that they cannot reasonably be attributed to individual hallucination or imagination alone. The medical establishment has largely normalized these experiences by attributing them to some form of undetectable neural activity, or by simply avoiding the question entirely, relegating such accounts to the realm of anecdote rather than rigorous investigation. What remains striking is the fundamental disconnect between what we understand about how the brain produces hallucinations and the actual character of these deathbed visions, leaving us with a gap in our knowledge that persists despite decades of modern neuroscience, and despite thousands of documented cases provided by reliable witnesses at the moment of death itself. Among the most perplexing deathbed phenomena documented by palliative care workers and hospice nurses is the consistent recurrence of specific, coherent imagery that appears across patients with no shared cultural background, medical history, or prior communication with one another. A pattern known as repeating coherent imagery that defies conventional explanation through memory, hallucination, or psychological conditioning alone. Patients in their final hours or days frequently report encounters with the same archetypal figures, landscapes, or symbolic scenarios, describing tunnels of light, figures dressed in historical or formal clothing, gardens of impossible beauty, or deceased relatives positioned in identical spatial configurations, and these descriptions emerge with remarkable consistency in tone, sequence, and detail despite the patients having no access to one another's experiences or to any shared informational source that might have seeded such similar visions into their minds. The phenomenon extends beyond mere visual imagery to encompass coherent narrative structures, where patients describe complex scenarios that unfold with internal logic and progression, conversations with entities that provide guidance or reassurance, and structured journeys through spaces that possess architectural or botanical consistency that would be extraordinarily difficult to conjure spontaneously from a deteriorating brain. Conventional neuroscience attributes such experiences to the predictable effects of hypoxia, the release of endogenous compounds like dimethyltryptamine or endorphins, and the brain's tendency to construct narratives from random neural firing. Yet this mechanistic framework struggles to account for the precision of repetition across populations, the coherence of the narratives themselves, and the profound sense of meaning and peace that patients consistently report upon awakening from these visions. A peace that persists and shapes their final days in ways that seem disproportionate to mere neurochemical artifact. In hospitals and hospices across the world, caregivers and family members have documented a phenomenon that occurs in the final hours or minutes of life, particularly among patients who are deeply unconscious or sedated to the point where purposeful movement should be neurologically impossible. The dying person, often unresponsive to voice or touch for extended periods, will suddenly raise their arm or hand and extend it outward into empty space, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes with what observers describe as deliberate reaching motion. The hand may open and close as if grasping for something invisible, or the arm may stretch toward a corner of the room, toward a window, or toward the space beside their bed where no one is standing. Medical professionals have witnessed this countless times, and families have reported the same behavior with remarkable consistency across different cultures, hospitals, and patient demographics. Some describe it as reaching toward light, others insist the patient is reaching toward deceased relatives or spiritual beings, and still others believe the motion is purely neurological spasm without meaning. The scientific explanation typically points to involuntary muscle contractions triggered by the brain's final electrical activity, or perhaps the releasing of muscle tension as consciousness dissolves. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the apparent directionality of the reach, the seeming intentionality behind it, or the frequency with which it occurs in the exact moments before death pronouncement. What remains scientifically puzzling is not just the physical mechanism itself, but the consistency with which observers interpret the reaching as purposeful and directed, as if the dying person is reaching toward something that exists in a reality we cannot perceive. Despite advances in neurology and consciousness studies, we have normalized this phenomenon into the category of expected deathbed behavior, yet we have simultaneously failed to explain it with any certainty. In the final days or hours before death, when a patient has been refusing food for weeks, sometimes appearing skeletal and visibly depleted, a peculiar reversal occurs in which the dying person suddenly expresses a strong desire to eat, requesting specific foods with clarity and apparent hunger that contradicts their terminal condition and previous decline. Family members and hospice workers report these moments with striking consistency across cultures and medical settings, describing how a person who had seemed beyond the point of physical need would suddenly ask for their favorite meal, a particular dessert, or foods they had not mentioned in months, speaking with unexpected vigor about appetite and taste despite having only hours remaining. Medical professionals have attempted to rationalize this phenomenon through various physiological explanations, suggesting that shifts in metabolism, changes in medication levels, or temporary hormonal fluctuations might trigger genuine hunger signals in the brain even as the body approaches shutdown. Yet these explanations remain speculative and do not account for the specificity and timing of these requests or the apparent psychological clarity accompanying them. The phenomenon persists in medical literature as one of those documented observations that defies clean categorization, neither fully explained by neurology nor by psychology, existing instead in the liminal space between documented fact and medical mystery. Some theorists propose that these moments represent the mind's final assertion of autonomy and desire before consciousness fragments, while others suggest they may be connected to an unconscious preparation, ritual, or a biological mechanism we have not yet identified. What remains undisputed is that these sudden returns of appetite occur too frequently and too consistently to dismiss as coincidence. Yet their underlying mechanism continues to elude explanation despite advances in neuroscience and palliative care understanding. In countless hospitals and hospice settings around the world, medical professionals encounter a phenomenon so consistent yet so unexplained that it has become almost unremarked upon in clinical literature: the remarkable stability of vital signs in patients who are moments away from death. Individuals whose organs are failing, whose systems are shutting down, whose medical charts indicate an imminent departure from life, often display a peculiar steadiness in their heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen saturation in the final hours, as though some invisible hand is maintaining equilibrium even as the body deteriorates beyond all reasonable hope of recovery. Nurses report with striking frequency that they have observed dying patients whose vital signs remain surprisingly stable and consistent, showing minimal fluctuation despite the advanced stages of organ failure, organ rejection, or systemic collapse that should theoretically produce erratic and unstable readings. The phenomenon persists across different ages, different disease states, different causes of terminal decline, and different medical conditions, yet no comprehensive physiological explanation has been widely accepted or standardized in medical education and practice. One possible explanation lies in the body's final compensatory mechanisms, the deeply embedded survival responses that attempt to maintain homeostasis even when the conscious mind has surrendered to the inevitability of death. Yet this theory fails to fully account for the degree of stability observed or the way it contradicts what we would predict from our understanding of organ failure. Another consideration involves the role of the nervous system's parasympathetic dominance during the dying process, wherein the body enters a state of profound calm and reduced metabolic demand, creating an artificial appearance of stability that masks the underlying cellular deterioration occurring at microscopic levels. In countless deathbed accounts from across cultures and centuries, witnesses report a sudden and profound change in the ambient sound of a room at the moment of death, or sometimes in the minutes immediately preceding it. Doctors, nurses, family members, and hospice workers have documented this phenomenon with striking consistency. The ordinary background noise that characterizes any living space, the hum of machinery, the whisper of air conditioning, the subtle creaks and settling sounds of a building, even the white noise of human activity and breathing, suddenly ceases, creating an almost unnaturally complete silence that feels distinctly different from ordinary quiet. Some describe it as a deliberate muting, as though an invisible hand has dampened every frequency at once, while others report that the silence carries a quality of expectancy or presence that makes it feel less like an absence of sound and more like an active phenomenon. The silence sometimes precedes death by several minutes, establishing itself with such clarity that family members and medical staff often recognize it as a sign that the end is imminent, sometimes even before any visible change occurs in the patient's condition. This phenomenon has been reported so frequently and with such similar descriptions that it has become something of an informal marker within hospice communities and among those who work regularly with the dying. From a rational perspective, we might attribute this to psychological priming or selective attention. The heightened state of awareness that accompanies a vigil over someone approaching death naturally sharpens perception and may make us notice the absence of expected sounds more acutely than we would under normal circumstances. The expectation of death, deeply embedded in human consciousness through cultural messaging and personal fear, could easily prime our auditory system to interpret ambiguous sensory data as significant silence. In hospices and hospitals across the world, medical staff and family members have documented a phenomenon so consistent yet so defiant of explanation that it appears in nursing textbooks as an observed fact without clear mechanism. The moment when a dying person seems to recognize that their final breath is approaching, often within seconds or minutes of when it actually occurs. Patients who have been unconscious for hours or even days will suddenly open their eyes, sometimes speak a final sentence or phrase, take what witnesses describe as a distinctly deliberate breath, and then pass away, as though they possessed an internal awareness of their own mortality's precise moment. Family members report feeling inexplicable compulsions to step into the room at the exact moment a loved one dies, despite having no conscious reason to do so, describing an intuitive pull or sudden restlessness that drew them to the bedside. Medical professionals have noted that dying patients frequently exhibit a peculiar calm or acceptance immediately before death that appears disconnected from their condition, pain level, or sedation status. The rational explanation involves the dying brain's release of endorphins and the cascade of neurochemical changes that accompany organ failure, suggesting that this peace and awareness could be merely the subjective experience of neural activity patterns during shutdown. Yet this mechanistic framework cannot fully account for the specificity of the timing, the apparent volitional quality of the final breath, or the documented instances where family members miles away report sudden overwhelming emotional surges at their loved one's moment of death. Medicine has normalized this phenomenon into medical literature as something that simply happens, an observed pattern so widespread that its very commonality has paradoxically made it invisible to serious scientific investigation, leaving final breath awareness suspended between psychological comfort and neurological mystery. Among the most documented yet scientifically perplexing phenomena reported by hospice workers, family members, and medical professionals is the strange occurrence of terminally ill patients experiencing sudden, unexplained moments of clarity and wakefulness immediately before death, often referred to as the final surge, or what some describe as waking at the moment. Patients who have been comatose, unresponsive, or heavily sedated for days or even weeks will sometimes open their eyes, speak coherently, recognize loved ones around their bedside, and engage in meaningful conversation before slipping away within hours or even minutes, as if an invisible switch has been flipped that temporarily reverses the trajectory of their decline. Family members describe the profound shock of this experience, having prepared themselves for a gradual fading only to witness what feels like their dying relative returning to them one final time, sometimes to impart final words of wisdom, offer forgiveness, express love, or complete unfinished business with those gathered near. The timing of these awakenings appears to hold no correlation with medication levels, circadian rhythms, or any measurable physiological markers that neuroscience can currently track, and patients often demonstrate awareness that transcends what their medical condition should reasonably allow. The neurological explanation typically offered centers on a final release of certain neurotransmitters or a surge of endogenous opioids as the body approaches death. Yet this theory fails to account for the specificity and purposefulness of the interactions, the apparent awareness of surrounding presences, or the way patients seem to know that this window of clarity will not remain open for long. Among the most perplexing deathbed phenomena documented by hospice workers, family members, and medical professionals is the occurrence of shared visionary landscapes, where multiple people present in a dying person's room report witnessing or sensing identical environmental visions that appear to exist beyond the physical confines of the hospital room or bedroom. These accounts describe sudden shifts in perceived atmosphere, where witnesses simultaneously become aware of otherworldly landscapes, architectural structures, or ethereal environments that seem to overlay the ordinary surroundings. And crucially, these descriptions remain consistent across multiple independent observers who had no prior communication about what they might encounter. In some documented cases, family members have reported seeing the same unfamiliar locations, architectural details, or environmental features that the dying person describes in their final moments, creating a collective experience that defies explanation through individual hallucination or imagination alone. The phenomenon extends beyond mere visual perception, as witnesses often report synchronized emotional responses, sudden temperature shifts felt throughout the room, and an overwhelming sense of presence or non-human intelligence inhabiting the shared space. Psychological frameworks typically attempt to explain such occurrences through concepts like shared grief-induced suggestibility, wherein emotionally vulnerable family members unconsciously align their perceptions with the dying person's verbal descriptions, essentially constructing a collective narrative through subtle social cues and emotional synchronization. However, this explanation falters when multiple witnesses report specific details or sensory experiences that contradict what the dying person has actually articulated, suggesting the visions originate from a source independent of mere verbal communication or social influence. In hospices and hospitals across the world, medical professionals and family members have documented a peculiar and deeply unsettling phenomenon occurring in the final hours or moments before a patient's death. The sudden, inexplicable emergence of what can only be described as profound comfort and peace, often accompanied by a cessation of physical distress, a softening of facial features, and a marked improvement in the patient's ability to communicate or interact with their surroundings, despite the fact that their vital signs indicate they are in the process of complete biological shutdown. Patients who have been writhing in pain, gasping for breath, or exhibiting signs of severe distress for days or weeks sometimes experience what witnesses describe as a transformation. Their breathing becomes more regular, their expressions become serene, and they may even speak with unusual clarity about things they have not mentioned in years, or they may simply fall into a state of peaceful acceptance that seems entirely incongruent with their deteriorating physical condition. Family members often report that their dying loved one reaches out, speaks to people who are not present in the room, or gestures toward empty spaces with a look of recognition and joy before slipping away quietly. Some patients have been observed smiling or laughing softly just moments before death claims them, a reaction that contradicts every expectation we might hold about the experience of dying. The conventional medical explanation suggests that this comfort may be attributable to a combination of physiological factors: a reduction in conscious awareness as the brain begins to shut down, the release of endorphins and other natural painkillers as the body undergoes its final stages, or simply the relaxation that occurs when the patient finally abandons the exhausting struggle to maintain consciousness and bodily function. Psychological frameworks propose that this phenomenon may represent a form of acceptance, wherein the mind, having exhausted its resistance, surrenders to the inevitable and thereby paradoxically experiences relief. Throughout medical literature and hospice records, there exists a persistent pattern of remarkable timing coincidences that occur in the moments surrounding death, events so peculiar that they have accumulated into a distinct category of deathbed phenomena that continues to baffle researchers and clinicians alike. These perimortem coincidences manifest in various forms. A distant relative calls the moment a patient passes, a long-absent family member arrives at the hospital minutes before death occurs, a deceased spouse's favorite song plays on the radio at the exact instant of expiration, or a symbolic animal appears at a window during the final breath. Medical professionals working in intensive care units and hospice settings report these occurrences with such frequency that many have developed a quiet recognition of them as something beyond mere statistical probability. Yet the events remain largely undocumented in formal scientific literature because they resist quantification and systematic study. The psychological explanation centers on a phenomenon called selective memory and pattern recognition, wherein families processing grief and trauma unconsciously amplify coincidences that align with emotional significance while forgetting the thousands of times similar coincidences failed to occur, creating a false impression of meaningful synchronicity around the moment of death. Additionally, the heightened emotional state of those surrounding a dying person creates what neuroscientists call a hypersensitive attention filter, where the brain becomes extraordinarily attuned to environmental details and potential meaningful connections, essentially priming observers to notice and remember any coincidence, no matter how statistically unremarkable. In the final moments before death, a remarkable transformation often occurs that defies both medical expectation and psychological understanding. Families gathered at bedsides report witnessing profound shifts in their dying loved ones, particularly among those who had spent weeks or months in apparent distress, confusion, or agitation. The patient who had been restless, disoriented, or in visible pain suddenly becomes serene, their breathing steadies, their facial expressions soften into what observers consistently describe as a state of absolute tranquility. This phenomenon, sometimes called terminal lucidity or the surge before death, involves more than simple pain relief from medication, more than the body's final surrender to exhaustion. Medical staff note that this peace often emerges without any corresponding change in treatment, without new medications introduced, without any clinical intervention that would logically account for such dramatic emotional transformation. The dying person frequently speaks of seeing loved ones who have long since passed, of recognizing a presence in the room that no one else can perceive, of feeling drawn toward something beyond the physical world. What remains scientifically perplexing is that this peace proves both profound and apparently unshakable, resistant to the circumstances that only moments before had caused the patient genuine suffering. Neurologically, the brain should be degrading, oxygen deprivation increasing, cognitive function declining further, yet the evidence suggests something contrary is occurring. Some researchers propose it results from natural endorphin release, from the brain's final chemical cascade, yet this explanation feels inadequate to account for the particular quality of the peace witnesses describe, the almost purposeful nature of it. The phenomenon persists in medical literature and in countless family accounts, documented repeatedly across cultures and centuries, yet it remains officially unexplained, rationalized through frameworks that somehow never quite seem sufficient.